Okay, we should be live now.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the February 11th, 2023 edition of the Saturday Free School. Um, as you can notice, we're online today, but I'm Jeremiah. I'm joined by many members of the Free School, and today we're going to be talking about continue our discussion on Black Reconstruction, the 10th chapter, the Black Proletariat in South Carolina. But we're also going to be talking about the Rage Against the War Machine rally that's upcoming in Washington, D.C., and also give some updates on our Korea event. But I wanted to pass it over quickly to Emily first for some updates.
Yeah, we just wanted to start off by saying that you can see that we're online today. And that's because for the time being, for the upcoming weeks, we'll be doing free school online in this format. So just letting everyone know.
Okay, great. Um, so yeah, to start, I think we wanted to begin with the Rage Against the War Machine rally that's taking place next Sunday in Washington, D.C. And I'll let Jahan just give an overview of that event and what's happening.
Yeah, so I'll just talk a little bit about summarize some of the information about the event and what's some of the news has been covering, and then I'm sure other people have perspectives on it. So, as Jeremiah was saying, this protest, Rage Against the War Machine, is being organized on Sunday, February 19th and it's supposed to start at the Lincoln Memorial and then march to the White House to deliver the list of 10 demands. And the interesting thing are the 10 demands. The first one is not one more penny for the war in Ukraine, which is the primary reason this protest is happening. But two is negotiate peace. Three is stop the war inflation. Four is disband NATO. Five is global nuclear de escalation. Six is slash the Pentagon budget. Seven is abolish the CIA and military industrial deep state. Eight is abolish war and empire, and nine is restore civil liberties. And the last one, 10, is free Julian Assange. And I think this list is quite interesting because it's getting at the actual U.S. policies on the ground in Ukraine, the amount of money that's being spent, and referring to the economic consequences when they talk about stop war inflation. It's talking about the broader issue of NATO as essentially being responsible for this whole crisis. So it's quite significant. They're calling for the disbanding of NATO and tying it to the broader need to abolish the CIA and military industrial deep state. And now, as far as the organizers of this event, the two primary organizations that called this march, one is the Libertarian Party, the other is the People's Party. To give a little bit of background to people who may not be familiar with those organizations, the Libertarian Party is, as the name suggests, ideologically libertarian. But in the past, at least two presidential elections, they've been the number three vote getter after the Democratic and Republican Party. And so I think their vote, if you count up their votes in both those elections, they would be over a million at least, and spread out in different parts of the country. And then the People's Party is an organization which is emerging from the Bernie Sanders campaign. The founder of the People's Party, Nick Brana, he had some senior position in the 2016 Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, but then was very dissatisfied with the way the DNC had behaved in that primary election, and then were very disappointed with Bernie Sanders himself, basically accepting that treatment and not really challenging it. And so they began a process saying that they want to start a new progressive political party separate from the Democratic Party. And so these two organizations basically came together with this list of demands. And then subsequently, a number of other organizations signed on to this march. And there's organizations from around the country, from the Northeast, from the Midwest, from California. A lot of the other sponsors and endorsers of the march are also different caucuses or local organizations of the Libertarian Party or the People's Party, but also some other peace, anti-war groups, some groups of military veterans, among other organizations. And then there's a number of speakers also that reflect the ideological spectrum that's going to be present at this march. And as we've talked, I think we may have talked about before, this is being criticized and attacked by the mainstream media as well as the left as a quote left-right alliance because of the kind of ideological spectrum of people that are involved in organizing and speaking at the event. Although everyone is in agreement about these 10 demands. And the speakers also include, of course, members of these two parties, but a number of other people who have been longtime activists, some, again, military veterans who've been opposed to the war, a number of political figures, including former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, former Congressman Dennis Kucinich, former Congressman Ron Paul, and just yesterday I saw as well former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney of Georgia. It also includes a number of journalists, Chris Hedges, Max Blumenthal. The other interesting development is that it includes a lot of people who are basically YouTube and social media personalities, people who have YouTube channels. Most prominently, and I think probably the biggest person in terms of following on YouTube is Jimmy Dore, who's a comedian that hosts this Jimmy Dore show, but is actually quite political, has quite a large following on social media. And there are some others, this guy Jackson Hinkle, who I don't know a lot about, but he's one of the people who's been criticized for allegedly having, right-wing views. He's also a YouTube kind of personality. And so this march was announced, I think, about a month ago. I first saw it at least around Christmas. And since then, as I was saying, there have been a lot of attacks on it in different parts of the media. And in a lot of ways, I think it was the weaponization of cancel culture, something we've seen before. There are a lot of attacks on people for allegations of, inappropriate, like sexual behavior and things like that. A lot of which were not proven, some of which had other explanations. And they were being used to basically target specific speakers and specific people involved with the march. Basically, it seems in the hopes that it would divide the march. And it seems to me, at least, that there's a lot of energy being put in by the mainstream media and others to try to either stop the march from happening or try to divide it up into different factions. And so there's a lot of politics at play. I mean, there've been some of you have seen there've been critical pieces about this march, criticizing it in Black Agenda Report and other progressive publications. So that's kind of a overview. There are other things that I would like to say about it, but maybe if anyone else would like to, Doc, or anyone else would like to comment.
Can I just add also that part of the reason why we're talking about it today is because some of the members of the Free School are planning to go to attend the rally next weekend. So that's part of the interest. But I think to what Jahan was saying, yeah, there was an article published in Black Agenda Report by someone who hosts, I think, a podcast on Sputnik Radio, which is actually a Russian news outlet. But it was basically accusing, in addition to the left-right alliance accusation, which has been leveled against this rally, the other sort of main line of criticism is that it's like a white anti-war movement, and that it's basically erasing the efforts of like Black and brown and other minority efforts to organize against war. And I actually think that it's an important point to think about and talk about, partially because the article in Black Agenda Report, which is I think where there's been a lot of online discourse around the rally. It's interesting to think about, partially because, if you think back to the anti-Vietnam War rallies that happened during the 60s and 70s, there was, I think, a valid criticism of those rallies being predominantly filled with white college students. But the demands at that time were specifically focused around white students being sent to fight in the war and that they opposed the draft. And I think there's a valid sort of critique there of basically the war, like the anti-war movement being like almost centered around like the self-preservation and like interests of like, you know, kind of white college students, and that there was that basically the sort of ideological foundations of it needed to go beyond just focusing on like, you know, the interests of like young white kids who were being sent to fight in the war, but a broader vision that was articulated by Martin Luther King. But the interesting thing about like this whole Russia-Ukraine conflict is that even if, you know, let's say a lot of the speakers for this event are white, or if it's being organized by like libertarians or the People's Party, and there's a lot of white people involved, the focus is not really on, you know, people being sent to fight in the war. Like that's not really the focus anymore. The main sort of vision of the rally is more focused on the broader, like basically the broader nature of American imperialism and of the deep state and the national security state, which I think was not really so much like, that wasn't really like the focal point or like the inciting point of the anti-Vietnam War protests. Although I'd be interested to hear what other people's thoughts are in terms of comparing like the Vietnam War protests with this kind of rally. And yeah, I'm planning to go, so I'm really interested to see like what kinds of people show up, because as Jahan mentioned, a lot of the constituency of people who are that we think will show up to the event will not just be people who are into like either the respective two parties that are organizing it, but more so the, you know, the online audiences of many of these people who are, yeah, like online, like media personalities, people like Jimmy Dore and stuff like that. So it'll be interesting to see who shows up. But I think, yeah, I think that was one thought that occurred to me in terms of like how, like why we think this is an important development and why some of us are going to the event. And also the fact that this event is not, you know, really trying to alienate the Trump movement, and is instead like inviting the Trump movement to participate and be part of it. And I think something that I think I may have said last week at Free School, but one of the reasons why also I think this rally is important, not even for itself, but what it represents largely, is that, you know, we agree with Du Bois and King that the struggle for peace can have a qualitative effect where it transforms the people who become part of it. And that, you know, even if you have qualms or disagreements with what the libertarians think, for instance, like the hope is that by joining the fight for peace, that this can have a broader impact on the people who are part of it, and that this can also transform the larger political vision of the people who are part of it. But yeah, those are just some comments I wanted to say about the rally. But yeah, if other people have thoughts, that would be great too.
Yeah, I've been following the line of criticism against this Rage Against the War Machine as well. And it's interesting because not only are people calling, or for example, organizations like the Black Alliance for Peace are calling this rally white. Like they're saying we're refusing to come because it's white. But I found that line of criticism so, like, I'm going to say interesting, but really I find it very wrong, because when you actually read the demands, what this any anti-war rally that, first of all, is even hosting a rally, like this is the first time, at least I've seen in the past year, anyone attempt to host an anti-war rally that actually names the Biden administration as a warmongering administration. Anyone who's naming the Biden administration, taking that stand, and also is taking the stand of saying like NATO is to blame for this. Like this isn't something that can be pinned on Russia. It's actually the real issue is NATO. I found the demands, like them saying like one of our demands is also freeing Julian Assange. Our demand is to disband NATO. Like we are like going to call out the Biden administration. I think that's very significant. And for me, I just think that any anti-war rally that is trying to bring forth anyone who is willing to criticize the current what is happening with the Biden administration's reckless foreign policy, like that should be taken seriously. It should not be like you should not be encouraging people not to go just because like you're upset that the speakers are open to make America great again or are open to Trump supporters. Like that was the criticism I saw. Like behind, it's not really that these speakers are white. It's actually that people are upset that these speakers are open to Trump supporters. And then in response to that, I see the same people making these criticisms. They will also say that like this rally, we won't come to this rally. Not only is it too white, but we're also not coming to this rally, and we condemn this rally. We're not just not coming, but we're going to condemn this rally because we don't think these people are actually anti-imperialist. And they claim that we're the real imperialists. So then I start questioning, I'm like, what's your definition of peace and what's your definition of anti-imperialism then? Because all of these demands and the fact that you're willing to criticize our own government, which is the reckless force waging war in the whole world, which is trying to create a new world order, that is that's taking a stand against the greatest force of imperialism today. And what's adding to the mix is the fact that PSL and the Answer Coalition, so that Black Agenda report article that Jeremiah had mentioned, the author, who is a member of Black Alliance for Peace, I believe, the author also talked about how the real anti-imperialist organizations are Black Alliance for Peace and organizations such as Answer Coalition, which is, I think, related to PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Adding to the rise of criticism is that actually the Answer Coalition and Party for Socialism and Liberation are organizing their own anti-war rally at the same place in Washington, D.C., except in March. Except that instead of saying that they're a rage against the war machine, and instead of saying that they're against the Biden administration, and instead of saying that we want to disband NATO, they're phrasing it as we want peace in Ukraine. Okay, so you want peace in Ukraine, but you're not willing to say that this whole war is because Biden wants a proxy war against Russia. And you know what I mean? So that's what's interesting, is this is also a conversation around who's starting to claim, like, what is peace? Like, I thought the peace, like you said, Jeremiah, that was a great point. I thought peace was about broadening. Peace is supposed to be a broad movement that changes people in the process. Why are you not interested in supporting? You may have criticisms against the speakers, but then why are you not speaking at this rally? Why aren't you coming to this rally? So I don't know. I think there's something significant in the criticism, in the sense that you're starting to see different forces, like simply because they're upset at the Trump movement, or they think Trump supporters are fascist, too white supremacists. Like, you're not willing to actually wage the war that should be waged today, which is the war against the military industrial complex. And yeah, what King said. King was like, the enemy is the profiteers. The enemy are the profiteers of war, the profiteers of white supremacy, the profiteers of poverty. And I don't know. I know I just talked a lot, but it's because I'm really upset. Honestly, it's because I'm pretty upset about the criticism. And I just think if you claim to be a leftist or whatever, you should be taking anyone who wants to disband NATO, anyone who's criticizing the Biden administration, you should take that seriously. You shouldn't just try to condemn it.
Yeah, I think again, it's to emphasize the point that I think the key, from what I've read, I think the major reason that the march is coming under so much attack is exactly because they are refusing to adopt the anti-Trump movement line of all the other like left anti-war organizations. I mean, the other organizations will talk a lot about, well, we believe in this, and like Emily was saying, anti-imperialism, et cetera, et cetera. But they will refuse to work with the forces in U.S. society that are now basically objectively the most anti-war, which is that base of that movement. I mean, every poll that I've seen, like I just saw a poll today by Gallup, it was saying that about 30 to 35% of Americans say they're opposed to U.S. support for Ukraine. Obviously, there's a lot involved there, how you phrase the question and things like that. But all the polls I've seen, it's always Republican. They always frame it as Republicans or Trump voters are 50% plus opposed to U.S. policy in Ukraine. And so, if you want to build a serious mass anti-war movement opposed not just to U.S. policy in Ukraine, but to NATO and the deep state, you can't build it without this base of people. And I after reading about this, like for example, reading that article in Black Agenda Report by this lady Jacqueline Luqman, she was like, "Oh, they're working. It's being organized by the Libertarian Party, which has been taken over by this Mises Caucus, and they've been listed as a hate group by Southern Poverty Law Center, something we've seen before." Southern Poverty Law Center seems to basically target all the anti-establishment forces, and including the Nation of Islam, by the way, which is interesting. But the other thing is, I think also you can tie a direct line to the left that's opposing this march to the same left that supported Russiagate and also basically supported Fauci and Fauci's role throughout all the stuff that happened with COVID. And basically they attacked everybody among the masses who were questioning those things, and were trying to help the deep state kind of reconsolidate its legitimacy. And for us also, again, it goes back to the Trump question. And as Emily and Jeremiah were saying, if we want to actually build something anti-imperialist, I mean, you have to build a broad peace movement. And this is something I would be interested to hear from Doc, is that I was reading, coincidentally, Sonia Haynes had sent me an article that Karen Talbot wrote in 1969 about the national mobilization against the war in Vietnam, particularly the march that, I think there were two marches that happened. One was in DC and one was in San Francisco. And she was writing about the San Francisco march. And it was quite interesting because they're dealing with some similar questions like, okay, we're trying to build a broad movement. Of course, it's a lot of white people, it's a lot of different forces, but we want to have speakers that represent all the different forces. So we have everybody from like an ex-congressman and other kind of liberal white speakers to Reverend Abernathy from the SCLC to David Hilliard from the Black Panther Party to Coretta Scott King, and to try to bring all those and people from the Chicano movement and so on, and bring all those forces together. And while there are internal contradictions, the key is to try to take this broad-based movement, this raw anger that people have back then against the war in Vietnam, today against what's happening in Ukraine and the war inflation, and to try through a process of political education, I mean, mold it into something where people see the centrality of the Black freedom struggle, of anti-imperialism, the need to transform the state. I mean, this is obviously a process, but the struggle for peace is basically the best and broadest starting point for that process. And so it's a very dangerous and reckless thing for people to attack it. And all the people I've seen attacking it, whether it's this author in Bar, or today I also read a article by this guy in California, Jeff Mackler, who's from one of the Trotskyist organizations. They're all like, "Oh, how dare these people organize this peace march? We are the veterans who've been doing anti-racist, anti-imperialist organizing for decades." But I mean, at least in my lifetime, I've not seen any of the organizing go anywhere. They're more interested in turning the anti-war movement into just a cultural phenomenon where people get together and have a kind of shared cultural experience, and anyone who's not in their niche is not welcome, which means the masses are not welcome. So,
yeah. If I could just join in, I agree with Johan and everyone else. The politics of these groups are not real politics. It's politics through cults, and they are cultish, they are sectarian, and therefore outside of people like ourselves, they don't account for very much. We keep up with them merely to keep up with them. I guess for Johan, maybe they become interesting as comedic characters in a larger drama. But I also listened to Brian Becker. Jahan told me it was given some months ago, but it seems like he was talking exactly about this march and claiming that the quote right and their quote left supporters had appropriated our demands. And in fact, I understand PSL is organizing a peace march in March, but does not go as far as the demands of this march. The so-called revolutionary socialists, this means quote unquote, are not as advanced in their demands as this group in this rally are. I don't know that much about the Libertarian Party. Of course, they have economic theories that go back to what is known as the Austrian school of the 1800s, and those are always matters of debate, whether it's the supply side or the demand side, the market or the state that must play the key role. Well, that's academic debate, and it's not yet a huge political problem. But clearly, those economic theories do not prevent the Libertarian Party, however large they are, from joining in with what I'm calling a coalition of the discontented, of the most alienated, of those who have given up on the ruling elite's capacity to run this country and its foreign policy. It is perhaps, in this mass sense, the most significant targeting of the forces of the state, the deep state, of the military-industrial complex that I have ever seen. And I have made the claim, and I think I'm accurate in this, the American people are more pro-peace today than they were at the height of the anti-Vietnam War protests. And I think we're going to see it manifested. I just wanted to say something else here. The Black Agenda Report article, and I would say to Black Agenda Report, shame on you, shame for publishing such an essay, which is poorly thought out, poorly written, and I have no idea who this person is and where she comes from and what her bona fides or resume is in relationship to the fight for peace and against imperialism, or for that matter, against racism. I mean, all of this, because you're Black, I'm to presume that you have a progressive position on the fight against racism. I don't make that assumption. I don't make it, and I don't want to make it. And just like, for myself, I present my record, my views publicly, and I'm not in some out-of-the-way think tank in, of all places, Washington, D.C., and we know what runs that geography. So I like to know more about these people and how they conceive of peace. But it's very obvious that this is from Black Alliance for Peace and others, that they are anchored to a failed political, an ideological and theoretical position, and that is settler colonialism. They have been rendered immobile and incapable of mobilizing the masses. We have said this before, we'll probably get into it a little bit more as we go forward in this discussion. The theory of settler colonialism demobilizes rather than mobilize. It is not a theory that sees the capacity of the American people. And let us say that once again. Am I talking too much? If I'm talking too much, shut me down. You know, I'm here with my friend Ransom. But you know, every theory, every ideology has to be judged in the final analysis on how it contributes to uniting and mobilizing the people against a common threat, a common enemy. If it divides the people and hence demobilizes them, it cannot be called a progressive or radical theory. It has to be called its opposite. Objectively, it assists the war makers and enemies of the people, not the people. And, I look forward to the time when those who are the champions of this theory will come forward and discuss these matters with the free school. Let us not hide behind, how should I put it, badly researched books and keep pointing to read my book. Well, now we've read your book. And one thing after reading your book that we found out, that your research and presentation of your research is very questionable. In fact, I would say this, a lot of that stuff, if it were presented, hey Joe, if it were presented to a PhD dissertation committee, it would be rejected because of the poor scholarship. It wouldn't even pass a PhD. But from the political standpoint, the point is to demobilize the people. The other thing is, for example, the man that you mentioned out in California, a well-known Trotskyist and a well-known sectarian. Again, their record in the anti-war movement, to put it mildly, was less than stellar. They failed to recognize the transformative role of Martin Luther King and Muhammad Ali. When they entered it, they transformed, they led to what was potentially a transformation of the anti-war movement, especially among the Black working class. But let me end on this. See, the question is not, is the rally too white? Well, maybe it is too white. But all of these people, many of these people claiming it's too white, have been a part of all white marches and demonstrations. That's, as a matter of fact, that's all they've been a part of. It's not as though they have a stellar record in uniting people of color to do any damn thing, So let's kind of get that off the table. That's not the issue. The issue is peace. That is what they are opposing. Let us not forget, when Martin Luther King Jr. came out against the war in Vietnam, the entire ruling elite, their newspapers, their politicians, a good part of the civil rights movement came out against King. Any figure, Robeson, Du Bois, what was the question that the ruling class used to turn the people against them, to distort what they were saying? It is the question of peace. Robeson and Du Bois, anti-nuclear weapons. Martin Luther King, anti-Vietnam War. This march, anti-NATO, anti-US in Ukraine. And by the way, if you don't see not only the possibility of nuclear war over this, and how far the Biden administration will go, we don't know. But it is we, the US people, who have the responsibility and the duty to stay the hand of the war makers in this country. All this nitpicking and pettiness is, I think, the work of the enemies of the people. They did it to Robeson and Du Bois. They did it to Martin Luther King. They attacked the Million Man March in the same way. This is what they do. And they should be condemned. And the Black Agenda Report should be ashamed of itself. Should be ashamed of itself. And Black Alliance for Peace, well, now you're exposing that you're really not an alliance for peace. And you do not reflect the interest of the Black community. I think this is the bottom line. On this matter, I think we should take a position of we take no prisoners. There's no more talk. There's nothing to talk about with you. You are not a worthy part of the conversation that must go on among the people. You do not deserve to be a part of it, to be welcome to the table. You are disruptors. You are enemies of the people. You are enemies of peace. And most of you probably are in one or another way supporting the US position against Russia. I know for a fact that some of these detractors have referred openly to Putin as a fascist. Others among them, or of their ilk, have referred to the Chinese government as a fascist government. Now, explain this to me if you're so interested in a white march and Trump is a fascist and Putin is a fascist. Well, here's a march calling for an end to the funding of the war in the Ukraine. As anybody with an ounce of sense that has read anything close to a newspaper in the last 8 years knows that the overthrow of the government in Ukraine in 2014 was spearheaded by open Nazis, not neo-Nazis, not reform Nazis, but Nazis whose legacy goes back to killing tens of thousands, if not millions, of Poles and Ukrainians. So what are we talking about here? Well, let's know, we talk about right, left coalition, or let's talk about coalition of the discontented. Let's talk about a coalition of those who don't want to study war no more. Let's talk about the legacy of Martin Luther King being infused into the sensibility of people who would say we're free market capitalists. We want to make capitalism work better. But we agree with Martin Luther King that war is the enemy of the poor. What, I'm going to say to them, well, you're a white person. You don't have a right to use the name Martin Luther King. Well, who in the world, who among us who have a political sensibility, who wish to see a new America, how could you say that? Well, like my last point, it all goes back to the settler colonialism. We don't want the US people to unite because our theory is predicated upon a new division, a new color line, incapacitating the people. That's what we're looking at. But I think this is going to be one of the most important marches in decades. It does have a weakness. There are weaknesses all over the place. It's almost, you look at it, you say, well, these are very inexperienced people. But that ain't they're inexperienced. But there's something deeper than that going on. And yes, I don't see the internet or YouTube as the principal site of mobilizing of the people. Maybe they're right. Maybe it does have a capacity that I am not aware of. But you have to go to the churches, you have to go to the unions, you have to go to the community organizations, you have to be where the people are. I don't know that they know that quite yet, but for this movement to sustain itself, it must institutionalize itself at the grassroots. But people learn, people will learn, people will grow. The main thing is to get them in movement. And just one last thing, this idea that they have quote, they have appropriated our demand. Well, when did they become your demands? I mean, when did you get ownership of calling for the freedom of Julian Assange? Well, can't nobody else say that but you? You know, I ain't even heard y'all mention an end to NATO. So, I mean, that ain't your demand anyway. You ain't even went there. So, I mean, the left is like the clown car in the circus train. A joke. They've appropriated our demands. You don't own no demands. Suppose they call for socialism. Oh, they can't do that because that's our thing. Well, when did it become your thing? And why is it your thing? You don't own this. And you are not the final judge over who can do anything. In other words, they had to come to you, who ain't organized nothing ever. Well, okay, yeah, you have organized. I mean, a lot of times you were hooked up with the nonprofits and they use you, and so you look like you were leading the Black Lives Matter movement, or whatever that was. You know what I'm saying? But come on, man. Y'all, you don't own the people. The ruling class does not own the people. This is a declaration of ideological political independence. And if Trump sides with the call for peace in the Ukraine, what do you say? Well, we don't accept it because he's appropriating the slogan of peace. And I agree with Jeremiah and Johan, and I think Emily, what I heard. I agree with y'all. In the back of this is a ruthless anti-Trump politics, which means that they are more in alignment with the ruling class of this country and the deep state of, by the way, they never called for the end of the CIA. All of them, across the board, from Jeff Mackler to PSL to Black Alliance for Peace. I ain't heard it. Maybe they'll come out and say, well, we did call for it, but we dropped that demand when it got a little dangerous. But I don't want to make a joke. But I know the free school is going down there. We're proud to be a part of this. Proud to be a part and celebrate those people who have come forward at this time, this dangerous moment in American and world history, and say, we ain't gonna study war no more. You ain't gonna take our sons and daughters and send them into wars, permanent war. You know what I'm saying? Now let's be real. When Bush and them said we're gonna go into Iraq based upon a lie, we marched, and there were great marches in this country and around the world, but we could not stop the war machine. This moment is different. This moment is different because not only is the sentiment against the war machine, the military-industrial complex, the security state, but it has a broad mass basis. This is what is so profound, and hence the crisis of legitimacy. The crisis of legitimacy and the call for peace. Let me shut up. I was going to analogize it to 1917 in Russia. It looks very similar. That doesn't mean we're on the cusp of a revolution, but if it doesn't look the same, the call for peace. And when Lenin, the author of the Russian Revolution, returned in April in a sealed train from Switzerland, provided by the Germans who were at war with Russia, Lenin took that bold move. He could have been killed as an agent of Germany. You know what I'm saying? But he came back. And the main thing he called for is peace. That if we can get peace, the possibility of a democratic transition to a new regime, a new government in Russia. That's the same thing here. A defeat on the battlegrounds of Ukraine opened the door to new possibilities of the democratic struggle. And I say to the quote left, get out the way. Get out the way. You're like a mosquito on an elephant's ass. You're just an irritant. You're not really a player. You're not really a player. And that's all I wish to say. Thank you. I'm sorry I spoke so long. I see Joe laugh. He always laughs when I say something. Why are you laughing, Joe?
No, I'm just enjoying this discussion a lot. Anyway, I think Emil wants to say something.
Oh, I'm sorry, Emil.
Well, he might have.
He's gone.
Okay. But I wanted to say, I think Doc hit the nail exactly on the head when he said the arrogance of the left to say these are our demands, or these organizations to say that these are our demands. I think that's also really at the heart of it. I mean, it's extremely arrogant to say peace is your demand, freeing Julian Assange is your demand. No, these are the people's demands. And we are in a qualitatively new stage. I mean, this march, I'm sure, has contradictions and things might go wrong, but this is a new beginning, I think, because it is really amazing that all these forces, including the Libertarian Party, are literally saying not just end the war, and not just not one more penny for Ukraine, but they're also saying abolish the CIA, abolish the deep state, abolish war and empire completely. You know, that's a hell of a thing. And I think this settler colonial thing, we're totally right about that. We have to tackle this head on because this is meant to demobilize the people. It is meant to reinscribe the color line. And, as I was reading about this march and the different plans for it and so on, the fact that it's at the Lincoln Memorial, and, we keep talking about the creation of a new American people, the founding of a new American nation with Martin Luther King as the founding father. And I really think that for the vast majority of Americans, the Lincoln Memorial is not even about Abraham Lincoln anymore. It's much more about Martin Luther King and the March on Washington. Everybody who thinks of the Lincoln Memorial thinks of Martin Luther King. I mean, it's like, okay, Lincoln, these statues there, but really it's more known for Martin Luther King. And this whole thing, his spirit maybe in a very sometimes unconscious way is animating this sentiment, and I think definitely is there in this march, which is why it's happening at the Lincoln Memorial. And it's like that Black Agenda Report article saying hashtag anti-war so white, I think is a horrible thing, because I think it's a great success if masses of white people are like, we're gonna march. We're going to go from the Lincoln Memorial to the White House, marching to end the war in Ukraine, end the CIA, end the whole concept of war and empire. I mean, I think it's a triumph for the legacy of Martin Luther King. I mean, we have to take this to its completion, but this is a very, very significant step.
Sorry, I just have a really quick point, but when you look at the formulation of the demands of the Answer Coalition protest and like the Rage Against the War Machine protest, it's pretty clear that the Rage Against the War Machine protest actually formulates the demands much better, because Answer Coalition just has like their same old thing, which is like end the $100 billion in arms shipments to Ukraine, and NATO, stop the permanent war economy that funnels trillions of dollars away from jobs, education, and healthcare. Negotiations now, the people of the US are not interested in the possibility of nuclear war, nor the Pentagon's policy of weakening Russia. No to war with China. And it's kind of like all a mouthful, because it feels like basically they always phrase it this way. And I feel like they think that they've hit upon like the exact perfect formulation, and they just need to like consistently gather more people towards it. But the order of the demands, and then compared to the Rage Against the War Machine one, it's much simpler. They're just like not even one more penny. And they're like, negotiate peace, stop the war inflation, just disband NATO. And then, yeah, the fact that it goes as far as like actually abolishing the CIA, abolishing war and empire, and restoring civil liberties, like I just feel like these are actually much more normal and reasonable demands that would actually resonate with the American people. And yeah, like everybody said, the demands don't belong to any person or any like sect. And so I feel like PSL and Answer Coalition have spent many years trying to rally people to like the same slogan. It's true. But instead of recognizing that maybe they have something to learn from this new movement and this coalition, and that actually this group has something right that PSL and Answer Coalition do not have, and that if they actually care about peace, they can learn something and join it. Instead, they're like they don't know what to make of it. And so instead they're like, oh, like they're doing it wrong because they're not doing it in the way that we're doing it. And I feel like it also shows how little regard they actually have for this entire group of society and like the many, many people who are likely to come to this march, which also shows, I guess, yeah, like the thing about if settler colonialism is like your hinge point or your breaking point of like who's allowed to be with you or not, it is literally like this thing of just trying to divide the society. And I just don't know how you expect to win anything.
Wait, Emil, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess what this conversation is making me think of is like, what culture is being reflected when we hear groups that are sort of expressing a deep cynicism towards people and towards people's like human capacity. Like what group of people ultimately sees common people in this way? That's sort of we can throw them aside, we can brainwash them, we can they're too stupid to figure things out and learn and grow and ultimately like take charge over their own lives. And I think that's something that we as in the free school.
Okay, looks like Emil dropped out, but if he's able to come back, well, there's also there's a good. Oh, okay, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think I was just gonna add to what people have been saying, but especially Doc's formulation of demobilizing the people, because I think for us at Free School there is a question of whether the range mostly of like celebrity personalities that consist or make up the individuals that are speaking at this event will actually be able to bring people together. And ultimately, it's not really about these individuals, but more so, are their ideas able to bring together people themselves that can organize? Because I think a question that we've also had with the Trump movement is it sufficient that they're just discontent? But rather, what does their discontentment mean in terms of them actually coming together and organizing against the government with each other? And that's not really an attack, but more of a question. Oh, well, it's not an attack, but those that are critiquing this rally as an attack, well, they also don't seem actually to be able to mobilize people or be organic to the people. But why are they shutting this down?
Yeah.
And I think that's ultimately what I'm also, like, me and the Free School are interested in, which is who are the people that are going to show up to this event, and also like what will come out of this event, where these individuals are brought together. I think the other piece is I'm less familiar of like the whole story of Scott Ritter. specifically, but I know he had posted the speech that he was going to give at this rally. And his speech, is he goes through, the motions of the recklessness of the government in engaging in even thinking about nuclear war. He talks about, the military industrial complex, but also the military industrial, but also congressional complex, where essentially, people of the state are so intertwined with all of the mechanisms in which war is continued in American society. But the most interesting thing is, in the latter half of his speech, he quotes Martin Luther King Jr. He incites Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy of being anti-war. And I don't think that's something that people think of when they use Martin Luther King Jr.'s name. And it's actually quite humble and seems like open to transforming this movement. If it's okay, I just wanted to read a couple of paragraphs, but there's actually a bunch of paragraphs that are really great. But he says, "I too have a dream that the people gathered here today will join me on a new journey of discovery, one that tears down the walls of ignorance and fear constructed by the war machine, walls designed to separate us from our fellow human beings in Russia, and instead builds bridges that connect us to those we have been conditioned to hate. But now, for the sake of ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren must learn to love." And that's really different from, the critiques. I haven't read all of the critiques of this rally, but at least from the ones that I have read, it's all very arrogant. There is no space to actually engage in conversation with each other and also the people. But instead, in this formulation, what essentially the paragraph that I've read, Scott Ritter is saying, there is a fundamental basis of ideas that we're gathered together today for, but it's going to grow. It's going to have to grow amongst the people. But I can continue because Emily was saying that this is good. But he says, "This will not be an easy journey, but it is one worth taking. This is my journey, your journey, our journey, where we will embark literally down the road less traveled. And yes, it will be the one that will make all the difference. It will take us, as Dr. King once cried out, from these very steps to the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, the mighty mountains of New York, the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, the curvaceous slopes of California, to every hill and molehill of Mississippi. This is an American journey, a journey of Americans united in the cause of peace and justice, and a world free from the tyranny of nuclear weapons. Our numbers will grow from 1,000 to 20,000, from 2,000 to 20,000, from 20,000 to 100,000, and from 100,000 to a million more. And who knows, maybe in June of 2024, on the anniversary of the 1982 gathering of 1 million people in New York City Central Park, where they rallied in favor of nuclear disarmament and an end to the nuclear arms race, we can come together and send a similar message to the war machine. 1 million people or more demanding that their government act in a manner that preserves and protects the lives and future of all Americans, of all humanity.
Damn.
But you can see how, our hypothesis of free school, that this country has been affected by the civil rights movement, by King, is so true, where it's not that, these leaders are saying Black people should be part of it. It's that they're calling, I think essentially it's calling to the broad masses of American people, and continuing this legacy of King, even though he's white. It's so beautiful.
That was really beautiful. Even his, okay, this is kind of literary, but even his reference to Robert Frost, right? I feel like he's making sense of what free school has been saying, our hypothesis of the emergence of a new American people. Scott Ritter is doing that in his speech. When he's he's not just talking about taking a stand against war. He's talking about how taking a stand against war will allow the opening of an emergence of a new American people. This will be the identity of a new American people, is us taking a stand against war. which is the prison. Like that is the prison of the American people. And I don't know. I got like, maybe I'm like maybe I just like really like stuff like this, but I feel like it gave me kind of goosebumps because to me it showed that everything we've been saying in free school is right, so right. It's what people are already thinking. Like, first of all, the impact, like King's legacy, his words, his vision, it lives on in people. It has lasting, it's an everlasting, like it's an everlasting legacy because it's the truth. Like he was so effing right. And yeah, it's also just moving because you can see like Scott Ritter, and I think not just Scott Ritter, but all these people who will come or who are paying attention to this anti-war rally, the fact that people are actually organizing an anti-war rally, people are trying to make sense of basically like the new American identity. Like people are trying to make sense of like, are we really going to let America continue to be defined by war, by imperialism, or is it time for something else to give? And yeah, and I don't know. I also really appreciate that you actually read his speech because I didn't read it, but it was really, that was really beautiful. But
well, I just wanted to add that I agree with everybody. This march, the fact that it's being organized at the Lincoln Memorial, and just what people have been saying about it, it definitely does bring to mind a continuation, not without contradictions, but a continuation nevertheless of Martin Luther King's legacy. And if you compare it to the Black Agenda Report article, which by the way, I mean, it was not just ideologically bad, but I mean, it just was so mean-spirited and so full of hate. It's almost like they were trying to hide the weakness of analysis by viciousness of words. But that article also invokes Martin Luther King Jr. But the way it does that is almost like an insult and a diminishing of his life struggle and his legacy, because it sees him just within the bounds of a Black figure instead of a great American revolutionary who is an inheritance for all American people, and especially anticipating, the coming forth of a new American people through struggle, like this march would represent. And I mean, I read the Scott Ritter speech. I was a little unsure about, the whole thing about him pulling out of the march and so on. But yeah, the fact that it seems like he has a clearer interpretation of what Martin Luther King represents to the anti-war movement in the United States than this person who wrote the Barr article even managed to scratch the surface of.
Okay, while we still have a meal for, do you want to finish what you were saying?
I could try. I don't know how long I'll last,
Okay.
but what I'm just trying to get at is this thing of human potential. It's something that we, the Free School, put a lot on, and it's something I think even Fidel talked about, how those who have control over the U.S. government, those forces that we are fighting, they really demean human beings. They really don't see the potential of human beings, and this is really ultimately a very short-sighted view, because it is human beings that shape the world in which we live. It is the mass of people who determine, the moving forces in history. I was also thinking of Frederick Douglass's quote about being able to unite with anyone to do right and with no one to do wrong. And ultimately, that's speaking to the potential of human beings. It's when he's speaking about joining forces to fight in a civil war, he's saying, let's not deal in this dead past. Let's deal with the living present. It's not to say the past hasn't affected us, but we can't be stuck there. And I think much of the forces of that are trying to disunite people from attending this thing are stuck in a dead past, stuck in a.
Okay, we lost Emil again. Hopefully he'll come back. Is it okay if I read some comments from YouTube and Facebook? We have a lot regarding the rally, so I'll try to be quick. But Danny Jacobs says the old Second International's Wilhelm Liebknecht, the father of Karl Liebknecht and a friend of Marx, his slogan was, quote, "Not one man, not one penny for the system." Sorry, I'm just reading some social media comments. And then Danny also asks, how does the question of war and peace become a white thing? Like, how is it that the question of war and peace can only be cast as like a white thing when it's a human thing, as Emil was saying? It's an American problem. Stephen Palmier says that sectarian missives are in themselves an exposure of ruling class ideological seepage. Unity and struggle requires leadership that has authentic confidence and respect in the masses. Talking stink about the people's capacity to discern, strategize, and discipline themselves uncovers this basic lack of confidence and substitutes in its place hubris regarding one's own analytical talents. Puffed up and disdainful of the people, they are puffed up and disdainful of the people's abilities. Thus, the critic becomes the savior. Paternalism and a chauvinistic regard isolates their perspective, while an appreciation for the interests of the class takes something. Then Danny also says the left is an obstacle to itself. The question that gets avoided by the left is, can you bring the libertarians to the left? There are many different paths to socialism. Any mass movement will have all kinds of views, reactionary, progressive, etc. He adds, he adds some more context that libertarianism traces itself to 1848. It comes out of the crisis of society and hence is a one-sided anti-capitalism. Therefore, libertarianism is a confused anti-capitalism. The right, the quote-unquote right, is the foil for the left with inverted commas. They mirror what the left ought to have taken up. Marx thought that the Paris Commune fulfilled, in fact, libertarian demands. And then Don DeBar has a lot of also comments saying, maybe we should write a reply to Black Agenda Report, all of us going through it line by line, the Black Agenda Report article, but it should be done to make the Black Agenda Report deadline for this week. And he says the author of this piece has a program on Sputnik, which is a Russian radio station in DC. Going into the 2024 election, acquiescence and or support for this war with Russia should be a disqualifier for the election. This is intended to remove this from the electoral calculus. In other words, it is an existential shill for the Democrats. And he says, ultimately, the Black Agenda Report piece is not a left critique. The fixation on the Mises caucus could be reduced to, quote, I hate these Mises to pieces. Mises to pieces. They are actually outliers to the rally. They pressured organizers to drop Scott Ritter from the speakers list, and it was only his decision to step aside that preserved the rally and perhaps the national structure of the Libertarian Party. Characterizing this rally as their creature of the Mises caucus is factually incorrect and in fact practically infantile. Is Cynthia McKinney in league with the Mises caucus? Is Dennis Kucinich? And I'd like to point out that while the author has her points of reference credentialing speakers and supporters as authentic anti-war voices, it's worth noting that Dennis Kucinich sued the Obama administration in the only official attempt to end the destruction of Libya. I don't remember hearing from the author or Black Agenda Report on that, or Black Alliance for Peace on that case, which ran in the courts from May until October of 2011. And then, can you go up to the?
It's gone. There's only that part of it left.
Okay.
But it's still there.
Okay, and then also Daryl Waistline Mitchell says in a comment, which I can't read all of the comment from StreamYard, but he says, the left right-wing designation from the 1789 French Revolution is obsolete. Think about America in 1850. The Republican Party formed in 1854. America is approaching a, quote, Lincoln movement, which required splits of the existing parties of that era. Lincoln was elected in 1860 with 4 out of 10 votes. Breckinridge split the vote. Black petty bourgeois intelligentsia, i.e. Black Agenda Report, is entering bankruptcy. The rally is not too white. The Anglo section of the destitute proletariat support is the condition for peace and proletarian revolution. And then he says more, but I can't see it. And then Todd Doherty asks, can we get Dr. Montero a speaking slot at the anti-war rally? I don't know about that, but Nathan Barraza, this is the last comment, but Nathan Barraza says, I was thinking how it seemed like the civil rights movement gave way to the peace movement back in the day. But like what you guys have been saying, it seems like instead a peace movement today can give way to completing the civil rights movement by uniting the American people and changing them through struggle. The memory of King and the dream of the Black worker who has dealt with the dictatorship of the proletariat rather than the American dream can really change this country. And actually, yeah, I think that's an important point, partially because one way you can interpret the Libertarian Party thing is that actually they represent in its most like concrete form what Du Bois calls the American assumption, which is like that anyone can come to America, become like a small-time landowner or something like a small-time capitalist and make it and succeed, which for some parts of the population was true, including some immigrants. But like what's actually interesting is that like this is a time in which like that American assumption is being challenged. And I don't think that the American people themselves are confident that like that's really the path forward for the country anymore. And like this is a time for the people to become engaged in an actual dialogue and struggle with each other to decide like what is the path forward for the country and how that revolves also around the question of war and peace. But yeah, sorry, I may have missed some smaller comments in the chat, but oh yeah, also Danny adds on YouTube that when people criticize the Rage Against the War Machine rally in terms of their critique of white people, they mean who is speaking at the rally, but we still don't know who is literally going to be at the protest. And so the Black Agenda Report article is completely vulgar. But yeah. He also adds, if the rally is too white, then we should help to change that. It is just sour grapes. It is just sour grapes that the quote right, and then parentheses, what is the left, made the first move on war and peace.
Yeah, what's funny is that actually reading Black Reconstruction, especially the Free Schools conversation of the price of disaster, and then now leading into the Black Proletariat in South Carolina, like Du Bois's whole point, he says that if America has any future to reach a dictatorship of the whole proletariat, starting with the dictatorship of the Black proletariat, it needs like poor white workers to have a leadership conscious enough of the democratic demand. Like that's Du Bois's whole point. And it's like exactly, and I feel like you formulated it perfectly, Doc, where you're like, this moment is different because we actually have a broad mass basis in a crisis of legitimacy. And it's like, and then it's weird to see people, like I guess Danny said with sour grapes, to see people be like, or like how we formulate it, where basically all these people who like support the settler colonial ideology, what they're basically saying is they're like, we don't want unity around a democratic demand. We want to stay imprisoned. We want to stay unfree. We want to stay like, and what does that say about, what does that not only say about your ideological analysis of America today, but also I guess this is what Emil was trying to get at. Oh, Emil's not here anymore. It was basically like, what does it say about your feelings about human capacity and the future of humanity? Like, are you basically saying you don't care then? Like, do you not want a future? But yeah, I also wanted to emphasize what you said, Doc, earlier about, I really liked this specific line, which is, you were like, you don't own the people. Like you don't, if you're in the left, quote unquote left or whatever, like you don't own the people. This is a declaration of ideological political independence. And that is true. Like, cause I didn't think about it like that, where actually there's arrogance, where you think that instead of saying what is organic to the people's demands, like what are the people's demands, instead you want to dictate like what the people should follow, who the people should follow, rather than it being a movement of the like a coalition of the discontented, a movement where people are going to change and shift as people coalesce and things like are taken, you know, certain ideological positions formulate and change. And yeah, and I guess I just wanted to emphasize again what we were saying about like this conversation really clarified to me, like beyond just the rally, it also clarified to me like the path forward, which is that this whole criticism is in preparation to take a stand against Trump, because they're going to denounce Trump by saying that Trump is simply appropriating peace, like that he's simply appropriating like quote unquote peace, even though Trump is actually like going to take the position of peace. And like you're essentially this means like your ideology is essentially backing backing the American. It's not only backing the state, you're basically supporting the state, but you're also trying to back the American people into a corner. Like that's essentially what your ideology does.
Yeah, I just want to build off of what Emily was saying. There are two things I want to address. One, do Black people have a set of grievances concerning our historic and present condition? Yes, we do. Should we say that as Black folk, we want the global situation to come to the point of, if not actual, so close to nuclear war that the system goes into shock and crisis, and the ruling class will then have to negotiate with Black people? In other words, a kind of the worse it gets for world humanity, the better it will be for Black people. First of all, there is no progressive or revolutionary Black person that has ever taken a position that we should separate ourselves from world humanity. It has been the position going back to Frederick Douglass and probably before him, that we are part of progressive humanity. We want the Vietnamese to win. We want the Vietnamese people to be better off, because that will be better for the struggle for our rights. We want Ghana to be independent because it will be better for our struggle. That's what real Pan-Africanism is about, to separate us and to supposedly, allegedly, hold humanity hostage, a kind of a blackmailing of humanity. You know, this is morally degenerate and politically and ideologically reckless. As Purba said to me, to speak like this is to speak like a maniac, a person without any sense of the world, a maniac, a person so insane that anything goes, and that only the worst case, i.e. nuclear war, could be the best case for we African Americans. You read that article in Black Agenda Report, the underlying, I'm not even going to say logic, the underlying assumption is you called this rally without coming to us. And since you didn't come to us, we're going to attack it as a white supremacist rally. I don't know, you know, going back to the 60s and the 50s and the civil rights movement, I don't ever recall anybody speaking in those terms, in that tone, in that belligerent. They didn't talk like that. King and those went into the South. Stokely Carmichael went into Mississippi and went to jail many times. But their concept was to build a united front, at least when Stokely was a part of the civil rights movement, a coalition against Jim Crow. You know what I'm saying? And that meant North and South, but they went into the South. The other thing, what was that other point I wanted to make? There's one other point I was listening to Brian Becker in this interview on their, I think, podcast. And I found it quite offensive in the ways that he talked about Black people. And, you know, this, I have to say, it was like I was reliving things that went on back in the days of the civil rights and anti-war movements, where he was saying that he and his party must not be involved in any activity that involves people who have said things or done things offensive to Black people. Well, first of all, I felt it was extremely patronizing because, number one, we don't need you or anybody else to speak for us. Now, we got a lot of voices in the Black community that speak for us. We disagree. I disagree deeply with a lot of Black people, but I don't need you, Brian Becker, or any other white person to mediate my relationship with political forces that are coming together. I can do that. I can do that. And this kind of silly virtue signaling, look, I'm in solidarity with Black people and I'm prepared to do whatever they ask me to do. Come on, money. First of all, you're not prepared to do nothing we ask you to do, period. You're only virtue signaling. You see what I'm saying? The other thing is that, and this Scott Ritter speech, Alice, thank you for reading that. That is it's a very moving speech. It is a very humble speech. It is a white American out of the military, out of the conservative Republican Party, who has literally said that the future of this country is bound to the vision of Martin Luther King Jr. PSL would never say that. Trotskyists would never say that. It was they in the SWP iteration that tried to embrace Malcolm as the revolutionary against King, the integrationist. Now they said, well, we were listening to Black people. Well, yeah, you're listening to some Black people. That's okay. But the consensus view of Black America was that King was the voice of our struggle, of our aspirations, and increasingly so. This kind of, and I have to, return to the left in all of its, and it's not a left, it's a sect, a cult, a bunch of, just loud mouths. I don't know how else to describe it, who in the last year and a half, by the way, have found a new moniker, a new brand, and it's known as settler colonialism and the 1619 Project. And if they want us to believe that all they have to do is drag that out or trot that out and say it over and over again, and we should be convinced that that makes them, quote, revolutionaries. when in fact, in essence, they are anti-revolutionary. It is an anti-revolutionary position, more aligned with what Henry Winston called neo-Pan-Africanism and cultural nationalism. We just can't, I mean, this is one of those inflection moments where let's put all positions on the table. Like Mao said, let 100 flowers bloom and 1,000 schools contend. You know, let's debate. Let's talk it out as we enter into struggle. Let us think as we act. And we're not talking about fake research and scholarship that when the stuff is looked at, people say, well, that ain't what happened, or that's not true, or you misstated this and you misstated that. But yet you keep claiming something that your research does not prove as truthful because your research is fake. Now you say, well, Tony, you know, that's my man. I know that guy. I mean, yeah, from back in my days, yes. And I'm prepared to say, well, like Joe, you know, Jared Ball said, well, look, if somebody said that about me, I'd have to speak on it. In other words, if the quote white left is out to get me, you know what I'm saying? If they out to get me, and you write all these books, well, in the meantime, could you take a couple hours off and respond to these claims that your scholarship produces a fake view of really what was going on? Well, I can't do that. Let my scholarship stand on its own. Well, any scholar, when his scholarship is questioned, responds to say, no, my scholarship is truthful and what you're saying is untrue. Because what these people have said about that Horn's book, I mean, it discredits not only that book, but him as a scholar. You dig what I'm saying? And then to get a whole, how would you say, a ragtag army of other scholars, beating drums, walking down the street. We stand on the end, come on, man. Is it the truth? Is it fake? And then what are the political consequences of embracing that theory? Or, here's the last point, the idea Trump is a fascist. If Trump is a fascist, then what does that make Biden? Because at its essence, fascism is a politics of war. We've always, they could talk all that, oh, Trump looked like Mussolini standing on the balcony. Okay, I mean, all right, now you're doing, I don't know, facial recognition theory, okay? Or he, yada, 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 yada. But what is fascism? What is the essence of fascism? And don't tell me that in 1928, there were members of the socialist and communist left that joined the Nazis because they felt, yada, yada. Yeah, okay, yeah. But let's get at the essence. What is fascism? If you notice, people that throw that word around never give you a definition. You know what I'm saying? Never. I mean, okay, they say, well, it's authoritarianism, and you get some of them, they say, well, you got Hitler and Stalin and Mao. These are the great fascists of the... Wait a minute now. One of them said, I am a Nazi and a fascist. Okay? And he said, I am that because I want to reclaim the Eurasian subcontinent from the Bolsheviks. So I'm on a war policy out the gate. What administration in the history of the United States has been more belligerent and warlike, has brought us closer to Armageddon than these cats that we got in the White House right now. And if Ukraine ain't enough, they're already talking about in 2 years war with China. But he's a liberal. He's fighting for democracy and nuclear war at the same time. Now, how you come on? So you dig the problem we're in. So a lot of this sounds good if you're teaching a graduate seminar at Harvard, because you can say anything there. They're a bunch of dummies and perpetrators. So anything you say is, hey, all you got to do is sound good and quote Michel Foucault, or one of the other favorites of the, neoliberal, so and so and so. They have never defined. What do you mean fascist? What is a fascist? They say, well, Trump is down with the Proud Boys. Well, okay, but you haven't shown me they're fascists. Now, but yet, I can take you to Ukraine. I'm gonna show you some fascists. I mean, cats that march and tell you up front, I'm with the Nazis from back in the days. Tell you that. But you ain't say, if I want an example of contemporary fascism, you say, well, let me go to Ukraine, let me study them. No, you gonna go to Indianapolis, Indiana, or Cleveland, Ohio, and show me a couple cats talking trash. These are fascists. This is the great threat to our democracy. But what about them cats over in the Ukraine that you, Biden, supported to put in power? This is the ideological divide, the ideological separation that we're experiencing. All of them, and I think we can say it and not be afraid, are on the wrong side of history and will forever be on the wrong side of history. And I don't care, you can claim to be as black as the day is long. The historical question is not a matter of how black you are, but how ideologically correct you are, and they're wrong. Again, I'm talking too long. Excuse me, Jerry. I'm sorry, man.
And Serafina, did you want
Not much, but it just reminds me of when we were reading Black Reconstruction maybe 2 or a week ago, and we're talking about like the two worlds. Like that image came into my mind because right now it seems very stark. It's like a very kind of like stark contrast between like, okay, nuclear war,
Yeah.
or like, and the question of peace, and to the like the liberals and like the whites who want to live in the past and like not move this country forward, seems like such an abstraction, or like such like a thing that shouldn't be even on the table. Well, we should actually be enemies with Russia, or we should like, it's an entirely different worldview that they're dealing with. And they're asking the wrong questions. But I just, that image in my mind came up because I've been just thinking about how there are sections of this country who want to move forward, and there are sections who do not, and how much that holds back the people. And yeah.
Okay, there's been a few more comments. Danny earlier said that I think that we should think of it as like a vision for America. Danny says, I think it should be the American dream, in the sense that socialism would allow America to make good on like what Du Bois called the American assumption. Did you want to say? And then Charles Heald says, I'm glad I found this discussion, listening from Seattle, Washington. Someone named AG on YouTube says, didn't Fred Hampton go to the KKK to organize? And then Shantanu says, this concept of wanting the best for global humanity as a prerequisite for revolutionary thought is really helpful when trying to understand people who call Trump a fascist. VA from NY, that's their YouTube handle, says, this discussion should be published. And then Virginia Kotz also says, I haven't heard these points being made anywhere else. The free school should release a statement. Then Todd Doherty says, Gerald Horne says that our argument is not with him or his scholarship. Rather, our argument is with 18th century Black Americans. Quote, the problem isn't really with me. The problem really is a beef with the Black community and their choices in the 18th century. So he's basically saying that if we disagree with him, we're disagreeing with Black people from the 1700s. And then Danny also adds, the left call Republicans fascists because the left are Democrats, quote, nothing but Democrats. And then, yeah, Todd also adds that Gerald Horne was saying, historians have acknowledged for some time that Black Americans were not all on board with regard to the revolt against British rule. That this is Gerald Horne saying that basically Black people weren't on board with the revolution of 1776.
Yeah, I have something to say about.
Well, can I say just one thing, Noor? Yes and no. There were those who said, because the British said, if you fight in the British Army, you will be freed. Now they didn't say they would end slavery. They said if you fought in the British Army, we will guarantee you your freedom, type of thing. So he's right. In fact, a big part of the people who supported the British in the American Revolution ended up in Canada, in Nova Scotia. So I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, Virginia Kotz also just commented, I don't know any Black people from the 18th century, but I've been reading the Counter-Revolution of 1776, and it's actually pretty interesting because so far in the first 4 or 5 chapters, Gerald Horne is just basically describing numerous slave revolts like that were very violent in the 1700s and sort of the tensions between like the British, the Spanish, and the French. But the fact that he's focusing so much on like the violence of the slaves and like that was the form of rebellion, and then the tension with the white settlers who felt threatened, like I think that in some ways it's supposed to undermine Du Bois's view on the Black Proletariat and also King and the Civil Rights Movement, because Du Bois says in the general strike, like even in the opportunity of the Civil War, Black people on the whole were not vengeful. Like they didn't try to rise up and like kill their masters or like kill the plantation people. In fact, like they had a bigger goal in mind. And he's basically saying that the origin of struggle in America is inherently violent because it's like almost existential, that Black and white people could never, ever, ever coexist in America. And that's why like Black people allied with the indigenous and we're basically like locked in a struggle to the death. But you can maybe say that, like, I don't even think that that's as accurate to say about the 18th century, like in the 1700s. But regardless of what happened then, you can't deny that things have changed, that like in the Civil War and during Reconstruction, that something changed. And that similarly, like during the Civil Rights Movement with King, like the nation changed and the people changed. And you can see that in like Black Reconstruction, in like basically the minds of people who had fought in the war and like were forced to actually recognize like that Black people were human beings, that they were capable of so much. I feel like it's a pretty nasty argument to make. And to say that like we're disagreeing with like real Black people who lived in the 18th century, well, we're agreeing with like real Black people who lived in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. Yeah. And I think that also goes sort of to like the root of settler colonialism, which is that you're saying that maybe at the point of the founding of the country, there was a lot of violence. People did not know one another. And that's true, but that's also not the entire story. And also what matters more is where we are now.
Well, just to add to that, I was recently rereading the interview that Platypus did with Gerald Horne. Danny, I think, interviewed him. I just want to read 2 lines from there, right at the beginning, where he's asked the question, so why were you interested in the settler colonial project, and why were you researching the 16th and 17th centuries? And he says, and this is literally what he says, I was trying to develop a new story that I thought would be consistent with what is going on today. Because fundamentally, it seems to me that the creation myth story, even by its authors, is a bit incoherent. That is to say, supposedly, this country gets off to this great start with this grand constitution in the late 18th century, but somehow runs off the rails with Donald J. Trump in 2016. So, what he's basically admitting to is that starting from the assumption that the Trump movement and its supporters was essentially a fascist movement, he then went backwards to create a story about the founding of this nation that would fit that narrative. This was very telling. I mean, this is right at the front, and you can't really go past this argument that he's made, because it exposes all his assumptions and the agenda that he's trying to serve. So I just want to add that.
Yeah, can I add also, looking into his speeches and interviews as well, I think even if going a bit back into 2009 with the election of Obama and then the opposition to Obama, I think that one of his motivations for going into this project of, re-examining the founding of the country and everything was basically an attempt to characterize the opposition to Obama as also white settlers, and that basically led into 2016 and the Trump stuff that Purva was talking about. And in a speech that he gave in 2009 when he was launching it was at a book launch for his biography of Shirley Graham Du Bois. He said that Shirley Graham Du Bois and her entire generation of Black historians view of American history.
Okay, Jahan, I don't know if Jahan can hear, but you're cutting out a bit. While we're waiting for him to come back. Also, someone on YouTube named Will Hobbs says
Citizenship. They believed in this.
Okay. Yeah, if anyone has questions about the Rage Against the War Machine rally, I can try to answer them. I'm one of the volunteers for the rally. So someone named Will Hobbs on YouTube said, so if anyone has questions, they can ask.
I'd like to build on what Nuri was saying. You see, because can two things be true at the same time? It had long been known. I mean, Gerald Horne did not discover slave revolts. In fact, going back to the 30s, Herbert Aptheker wrote on this, and of course, Du Bois, going back as far as his PhD dissertation, a whole chapter was on the Haitian Revolution, which was probably the first scientific presentation of the Haitian Revolution in relationship to the struggle against slavery. The enslaved proletariat, as they would become, rebelled from the very beginning against their capture and enslavement. There's no two ways about it. This has been established in historical writing way over 100 years ago. And part of what that research was saying is to discount the racist idea that Black people were made to be slaves and appreciated being slaves, and therefore the overturning of Reconstruction and the constitutional amendments after the Civil War were right. This is the problem. Were they at the same time rebelling against the American Revolution? In other words, were the slave revolts also against the anti-colonial struggle that was being waged against Britain? I don't think so. And see, the thing is, and I've read the Counter-Revolution of 1776. In fact, less than a year after it appeared, and Horn does archival work in newspapers where in Southern newspapers, white newspapers, they recounted slaves rebelled in this county and yada, yada, yada. There was a slave rebellion here or there. Okay, very, very good. Not a new area of research, not a new thesis. By the time the book is published, it's well over 100 years old. And if you go back into narrative and Frederick Douglass, one of the things that Frederick Douglass talks about in his autobiographies is, first of all, his own personal rebellion against the slave owner who tried to brutalize them. And what he was trying to show there is that slaves were not docile. They were always contesting, and threatening and fighting back. The other thing that Douglass talks about, and he's in Maryland, not in Mississippi or Alabama, the real hardcore cotton belt, is that there were others like him, many others like him. And of course, there were all of these well-known rebellions, including Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser, and all of that. I mean, unbelievable. And the fact that it is left out of the American narrative is not the fault of the so-called white left, because it is the white left, many of whom sponsored and helped Gerald Horne in his work, who, at least in this wide sense, publicize this thesis. And Aptheker and Foner and all of them, including William Z. Foster, these people knew of Du Bois's work. You know what I'm saying? So he has said nothing new. What he does, and he does it in a scholarly way, which distorts the truth, is that the American revolutionaries saw these slave revolts and all decided to unite to get Britain out of the United States, what became out of the 13 colonies. But they wanted Britain out because Britain was going to end slavery in the West, in its Caribbean colonies and in the 13 colonies of the United States. There is no evidence of that. And the other side of it is, Horne talks about the reportage of the newspapers of the South. All of that is not accurate, by the way. But there is, as I remember the research, he does not speak about how the slave rebels saw themselves in relationship to the anti-British movement. How did the enslaved hear the words of Thomas Jefferson, "We declare these truths to be self-evident"? What did they think of that? I mean, so we don't actually know. Like he says, in the 1700s, Black people supported Britain and not the American Revolution. Well, just to put it mildly, he don't know that, and his research does not show that. There were Black people who indeed did support the British. And because of that, after the British lost, they were assisted by Britain to set up a Black community in Nova Scotia. That's why you get Black people up there. Well, that's not the only reason, but one of the reasons you got Black people up there. You understand? Black Canadians. You see what I'm saying? So it is a weak and logically unsustainable thesis. The fact that it has gotten so much publicity lately shows that a lot of people don't read books that claim to be scholars, and that even more don't read them carefully.
Can I just add two quick points to build on what others have said? I think one of which is that Du Bois wrote this pamphlet about the French Revolution in, I forget which year it was, but in that pamphlet, he briefly talks about the American Revolution of 1776. And he says explicitly that he acknowledges that some Black people fought on the side of the British, but most of them fought and believed in the American Revolutionary Project of 1776. And that actually many people at the time, including Jefferson, but also Black people, they assumed that the achievement of independence from Britain would mean the end of slavery. This was sort of an implicit assumption and goal of the American Revolution, but that the system that was set up with like the Constitution, basically like it sort of embodied like the contradiction of like, oh, can you protect private property when that property is slaves? And so basically like the system that was set up was not actually able to complete the original goal or unstated goal or assumption of 1776, and that you needed something like the Civil War and the Reconstruction era to actually like end slavery. But the other thing that this is building on, I think, what Nuri and Doc were saying, but part of the sort of implicit or unstated sort of argument of someone like Horn is that violence is the greatest test of the revolutionary capacity of Black people, whereas Du Bois would say that it is actually seen more in something like the general strike, which is, if you sort of reorient the way that you think about Reconstruction and the Civil War through the lens of the Civil Rights Movement, you could see the general strike as almost, or basically as a kind of non-violent, non-cooperation with the system of slavery, a mass movement of non-cooperation. And that Du Bois is saying that actually the general strike is the greatest revealer of the revolutionary capacity of Black people during this time. And he goes further, Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, and says that like he actually kind of sort of critiques the idea that that basically like Black humanity and Black manhood was only possible through participation in war. And he says that that's actually like a white idea of like what even constitutes like humanity or manhood. And that actually it's seen much more through first the general strike, but also the huge capacity of the Black proletariat to become involved in the Reconstruction project, to work as free labor for the first time to reconstruct Southern society, that is actually much more a test of what Black people's humanity and of their manhood, rather than just the fact that they were willing to fight in the war. And so basically someone like Gerald Horne is giving like a counter view, which is saying like, oh, actually like violence and war is the greatest test of like Black people's humanity and of their revolutionary potential. Is it okay if I read some more? There's a lot of comments in the discussion, but this is going back to the anti-war rally. Okay, actually, okay. I'll read Danny's comments. But Danny says he's quoting Frederick Douglass, who said that, quote, "If in its origin slavery had any relation to the government, it was only as a scaffolding to the magnificent structure to be removed as soon as the building was completed." Furthermore, Douglass said, "Abolish slavery tomorrow, and not a sentence or syllable of the Constitution need be altered." And then he also adds that Gabriel's rebellion was directly inspired by Jefferson's 1800 election. Jefferson himself represented slaves suing for manumission or freedom 3 times. The French Revolution is directly the result of the American Revolution, not just in its ideological content, but because 1776 bankrupts France and calls the estates. Jefferson makes due on the 1800 election in order to support the French Revolution. The Du Bois line about murder makes man is in the Coming of the Lord chapter. And then someone named Andrew Saturn also has a question about the anti-war rally, but says, Britain kept slavery going for a very long time after the American Revolution. The Declaration of Independence itself featured an anti-slavery, anti-monarch screed in the draft. Okay. Yeah, and then this is a separate point about the anti-war rally, but Andrew Saturn says, what? I already said that. Andrew Saturn says, why is the anti-war rally full of pro-war, pro-capitalist libertarians and other obscure front orgs like the ASU, but no socialist or communist orgs or known anti-war activists like Cindy Sheehan? Specifically, why are there headliners like Tulsi Gabbard, who is an active PSYOPs officer in the army, or Jackson Hinkle, who is a pro-war, reactionary, and chauvinist YouTube streamer? This might be a question that requires a back and forth to understand the context and intent here. I'm a communist who's part of the Socialist Party of America. And so, yeah, there's a further discussion about the anti-war rally, which I think we addressed in part in the opening part of today's discussion. But yeah, I think part of it will be, clarified when we actually go to the rally itself. But yeah.
And the thing is, I know Medea Benjamin, I believe she was asked and she refused because she said that her supporters and maybe her people that financially back her would not continue to do so if she participated. I don't know if Cindy Sheehan and any of these other people had been asked, but I mean, why should we assume that they're more anti-war than, for example, Scott Ritter or Jimmy Dore or Cynthia McKinney or any of the others? I mean, what is anti-war? And then this whole question of, well, I'm a communist and I wasn't asked, or why weren't communists asked? Well, the question is not whether you were asked or even whether you are a communist. I think we have to demand some political clarity, because everybody can be anything they define themselves as these days. And these overnight communists, Bernie Sanders sold out, now I'm a communist. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't make a lot of sense. What would be the tactics of communists? Let us take Paul Robeson. Where would Paul Robeson stand on this march? I think from everything I've read about Paul Robeson, he would support it. He would offer his criticisms of it. He would speak at it. And he would say, like we say, this is the American people coming to a consciousness of itself as a people. I'm certain Du Bois would have taken a similar position because they believed, and if one calls oneself a communist, for real, uppermost is the all-humanity project of peace against imperialism. No one is saying don't have, you can have all the criticisms you want, but to boycott this rally at this time shows you to be not what you say you are, but in fact the opposite of what you say you are. Because neither socialism or peace will come through your theory and your activism. I just wanted to say.
Wait, can I say I don't understand how anyone who publicly is endorsing these 10 demands of the march, how can you consider them pro-war? That seems I don't know, completely illogical to me. Maybe I'm missing something, but I think this is going back to this problem of people trying to turn being a quote unquote communist into an identity, like other identities, and making it about themselves. So I definitely think. I mean, I don't think any of the speakers, if they're endorsing this, whatever other issues they may have, they're not pro-war. And certainly with Robeson or Du Bois, when they participated in the Progressive Party and the Henry Wallace campaign, they're working with all kinds of people, but who are united on this point of peace with the Soviet Union, no Cold War, you know. So yeah.
I just wanted to. I had a general comment that was basically encompassing what was happening in the comments between the viewers, but it was reminding me about basically what you just said, Jahan, and Doc as well. When people are subscribing to identity politics, because what we're doing here isn't critiquing someone's identity, we're critiquing a message and an ideology. And I think that's something that's getting lost. And it's not just here, it's like in any conversation about the historical question of war and peace and who are actually for the people. It becomes this thread of egoism. It's like we all said before, you can't claim a message. Like you can't claim a people. Like this is a people's message. It's not about you and your personal beliefs and if you're getting credit for it and if these people are acknowledging you. Because at the end of the day, those are like personal feelings. You know what I mean? If that makes sense. Like if you're feeling left out, I feel like that's a personal feeling that you're attaching to a greater manner. So yeah, I just wanted to get that across. Like we're not here to critique and analyze someone's political identity because again, people can change their minds. Like you said, Tony or Doc, like people overnight decide they're communists because they were let down by Bernie. And it's not to throw dirt on those people. Like each one of us are on a path of trying to gain ideological clarity. Like that's why I'm here in free school. So I think there needs to be more grace there and there needs to be more of a focus for those people to like look at the message, not the person. You don't have to agree with an person's whole makeup to hear what they're saying.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what Sade said. Okay, yeah, there's more discussion in the YouTube, but do you think maybe we could move forward? Do we still want to read the so basically what we have on the agenda are continuing with chapter 10 of Black Reconstruction, but also reading an updated version of the appeal for our Korea event. Doc, is that something that you still want?
Well, why don't we do this? Why don't we just read the last of the comments,
Okay.
and then go to the appeal for the Korean event, and then if Emily will be so gracious to lead us in further discussing chapter 10.
Yeah. Okay. So just to give a recap of the YouTube discussion, Andrew Saturn is saying like libertarians are pro-capitalist. I'm not sure why you would say that libertarians are anti-capitalist. They want totally unbridled free markets. They advocate for buying and selling children. And also it says, yeah, I arrived late to the stream. But I think, so yeah, they're not saying that the problem isn't that they personally were not asked, but that the rally itself is sponsored by anti-communist organizations who aren't necessarily anti-war, but instead are just anti-status quo. And for example, the Mises caucus is anti-Chinese Communist Party, and I'm not sure that Robeson would be in support of a Mises/Libertarian Party or rally, even if it claims to be anti-war. And so, yeah, he's saying that like a lot of the libertarians are anti-China, and also says, I've been a Marxist communist since I was a young adult, and this isn't a lifestyle choice for me. I'm no Bernie Sanders or AOC. And then, let's see. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I just hate to get into this again. First of all, I don't know you. I don't know you. I would like to know you, but you've missed the very point of the discussion. We've been discussing for over 2 hours. I don't think you have understood what we're saying. This is not an anti-capitalist rally.
Right.
We here have not called it an anti-capitalist rally. We said it is an anti-war rally, okay? In a time where we are closer to nuclear war than we have ever been. That's all we're saying, okay? Now, you know, this communist identity, okay, be whatever you want to be. But then it's not a matter of what you call yourself, but the essence of what that is. And we don't have time to debate right now the essence of the communist position on war and peace, going back to Lenin. We could do that, but that's not what we're doing right now. I just don't know how you're conflating all of this.
Right.
It makes no sense. It's just, that's what I would like to say. I mean,
also, yeah, many of the speakers themselves, like I don't know about the organizers or the Libertarian Party, but many of the speakers themselves are not anti-China. They're actually, like, people like Jimmy Dore, like, went directly on Tucker Carlson's show, and Tucker is like a person who really does not like China, which I think everyone knows. But Jimmy Dore was the one who's like we can't go to war with Russia or China. And I think that, yeah, I don't know about the organizers, but also it's like you can't just expect, everyone to have the same opinions. And I think the fact that it is becoming very clear that the ruling class is pushing for war with China will force people who are anti-China to like actually reconsider, like, even if I have a personal dislike of China, do I want to go to nuclear war with them? Like, it's like that, like the actual real political existential question of humanity's future and of the future of like basically all the people in this country, like that, then it becomes very clear. And I think like you can, it's kind of a hypothetical.
You know, all of these people want to talk about the Libertarian Party. Well, there were two parties, I understand, that called this: the Libertarian Party and the People's Party.
Right.
I mean, so, well, are there socialists, or is the People's Party a socialist party, or what? You know, it's probably more socialist than the Libertarian Party. But there are two organizations, and then many others who are supporting this, including Caleb Maupin's group, which is obviously, they call themselves communists and socialists, and there are probably others in the mix.
Yeah.
So then we're left with one last argument. It's white people. You see what I'm saying? Because you can't, I mean, it's a coalition of pro-capitalist, small business, 19th century capitalism, not state monopoly capitalism, by the way, the Libertarian Party. You get them and socialists of various types, radicals of various types, and people who self-identify as communists. Okay, it's not going, who am I or any of us to say don't call yourself a communist because you ain't a real, look, call yourself what you want. But let's get busy on the ground. So I think this thing of how you're going to go to a march with the Libertarian Party because they believe in the 19th century theories of von Mises. Wow, is that your, well, it's a joke. Cat believes in von Mises. Hey, man, that's you. But I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
No, I just wanted to say it because I'm just kind of interested in I'm just interested in what the libertarian people think. I guess, like Danny was saying, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but like Doc was saying, they believe in they're pro-capitalist in the sense that they believe there should be like an absolutely free market, like there was in the I guess in the 19th century and earlier. So the interesting thing is that they're very critical of monopoly capitalism, which is where they have a lot in common with left socialists and communists, that they acknowledge that we're not in a free market, the state, the military industrial complex. And the other interesting thing is that they also talk about the Federal Reserve. And that's why the inflation, stop war inflation, is one of the demands, because they realize that the printing of money and the Federal Reserve as an organization, as an institution, being a way that private banks and Wall Street banks are basically control the money supply and everything, is another form of monopoly. So, I mean, I think that does give a lot of grounds for united front. And I think I mean, beyond that, if we're all agreed that the only way forward for whatever you want to call it, revolution, transformation in the United States, the first step has to be taking down the war machine. Then, I mean, then we're essentially saying that's the first stage of this project, and you have to work with everyone who's taking that position. And yeah, even on China, like Jeremiah was saying, like they may criticize, for example, the internal policies of China, whatever, but they don't believe, if they're saying abolish NATO, CIA, and end war and empire, they don't believe there should be any military confrontation with China or any other country, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, you name it. So that's those are very important principles for people to unite. It's not about a alliance of convenience. And yeah, there are many other forces as well. I mean, overall, I think why earlier I was saying this is a new beginning is that we realize that what passes for the left, these sectarian groups, that left ideology is completely dead, has no potential for uniting anyone. The American people don't want it. Nobody wants it other than a small niche. And so the question is, what is the new ideology? And we've obviously been engaged in this work for several years. And an event like this shows, like Doc was saying, a coalition of the discontent that are open. And we need to develop a new vision, a new ideology. And that's where we go back to these things of King, of the struggle for peace. All that has to be newly constructed. So to me, it makes total sense that there would be a mix of different people identifying as this, thinking this, because it's a coalition of the discontent. It's going to go through a process of being shaped into something.
If it's okay, then we can read the appeal for the Korea event. We read an earlier version of this a few weeks ago, but after getting some feedback from the free school and talking about it and working on it more, we have an updated version. And just as a reminder, the Korea event is happening on March 17 through 18 at the Asian Arts Initiative in Philly, where we've held a few events before. And yeah, we're working on a lot of the logistical stuff, but yeah, I think the vision statement is really, or the appeal, sorry, is I think grounding like what we want to say with this event. And actually, I think a lot of it is relevant to the discussion we've already been having today. But I think Mary's gonna read it.
Yeah, that's cool. So yeah, it'll be March 17th to 18th. It actually overlaps with the Answer Coalition protest for peace in Ukraine. So, but yeah, okay. So it's called An Appeal for Peace on the 70th anniversary of the Korean War armistice. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the armistice that marked a ceasefire and not an end to the Korean War. Military tensions are higher than ever on the Korean peninsula, threatening both the North and South, the surrounding region, and the entire world with prospects of nuclear war which have escalated to a frightening intensity. This is happening in the context of a rapidly changing world. New political systems and economic relationships are rising from China and Russia to the rest of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, while the US-led world order flails in an attempt to contain them. In the West, these developments have been framed as the resurgence of rival power blocs in a new Cold War. However, we in the Saturday Free School take the side of peace and instead view these developments as the realization of greater humanity's striving to finally overcome the age of empire and Western hegemony, to bring forth a new era of world democracy. In light of this special historical moment, we urgently raise the questions of peace and humanity's common future to our sisters and brothers, the American people. We, people of the Korean diaspora and of America, aspire to reclaim and synthesize the best of the Korean and American civilizations, both of which have contributed to the forward march of humanity and must do so anew for our time and generation. Korea's deep history is unknown to many Americans. We understand Korea as a unique and ancient civilization, originating approximately 5,000 years ago and characterized by the development of its distinct language, state, and culture. We believe that the Korean people are a people whose culture is anchored in a deep understanding of peace and its singular importance. Throughout their history, Koreans largely remained in the peninsula, surrounded by larger powers, never invading their neighbors in China, Russia, or Japan in aggressive wars. Rather, Korean historiography conceptualizes the development of Korea and its people as one of progressive unification of the peninsula over the centuries, towards a centralized, cohesive, and strong state. Sorry. Peace and unity have long been understood as an absolute precondition to the prosperity and well-being of the people. Many of the greatest works of Korean art and culture take peace as a thematic ideal. On the other hand, Korean art and culture have been thoroughly plundered and devastated by war and invasion. The past century of Japanese occupation, followed by the Korean War, disrupted the development of Korean civilization and left deep scars on the people, including Korean Americans. The subsequent division and artificial separation of one people who share a long history and a common destiny has also profoundly hindered their capacity to reach their full civilizational potential. Our event is an earnest attempt to understand the Korean people in their entire possibility, and in turn see our own humanity and capacity reflected in them. As a result of the unended war, South Korea today is occupied by the military of the United States, while North Korea is the most vilified, least understood state in the West. Despite this, the North has withstood 70 years of maximum military, economic, and political pressure from the US and collective West. It has maintained the sovereignty and legitimacy of its state, which has provided for its people a much higher life expectancy, level of education, and overall quality of life compared to other countries with similar GDP per capita. How is this possible, and what does it mean given the changes taking place in the world today? If we are to make a contribution toward peace and reunification, it is the North which will require the greatest reconsideration and new understanding from our part. North Korea is a country posed as a geopolitical enemy of the United States and as a philosophical adversary of democracy. The US ruling class and its allies in South Korea frame the North Korea as an isolated enemy frozen in the Cold War past, but we assert that it is the continued military presence of the US in the South that is the true anachronism of the Cold War, which only a handful of elites seek to revive. Asia is moving beyond its centuries of subjugation to the West, and North Korea is a country uniquely suited to this emergence of a new stage of history, with its long ties to humanity's non-Western majority and its contributions to world and progressive movements. In this light, we see the South Korean government's continued acceptance of US occupation and the broader neocolonial dynamic of its relationship with the United States as a remnant of a decaying epoch. This relationship must instead evolve with the times and in the true interests of the Korean and American people. We see this possibility because in the South, in spite of decades of dictatorship and brutal repression, a rich history of people's movements arose whose spirit can be recaptured for the present times. Figures such as Moon Ik-hwan and Im Soo-kyung reached towards the North seeking peace and reunification, framing peace as an issue directly for and from the entire Korean people. They acted in a spirit of good faith, openness, and courage, with the conviction that Korea's division was and remains today an aberration both irrational and immoral, which had to be overcome by the spiritual, ideological, and civilizational reunification of the people. They recognized that the democratization movement in the South to overthrow military dictatorship was fundamentally interlinked with the fight for peace and against imperialism. In this, they agreed with so many other democratic progressive movements around the world, including the civil rights movement in America, in proclaiming that democracy could never truly be fulfilled without peace and the complete self-determination of the people. This is a more advanced understanding of peace than the conventional one. It is best captured in the words of Martin Luther King Jr. as a positive peace, not simply the apparent absence of tension, but rather the active presence of justice. In the case of Korea, American imperialism has a stake in maintaining the current state of tension and making its occupation seem natural. Thus, any movement for change appears to be a threat to peace. A move towards justice would mean ending the war and letting Koreans figure out their own path to peace and reunification. However, the American ruling class frames North Korea as the constant aggressor that threatens the peninsula with nuclear tests and provocations. This narrative is propagated despite the fact that the US government, the only one to ever use nuclear weapons on another country, uniquely adheres to a preemptive nuclear strike policy. At numerous times over the decades, US politicians have openly proposed launching unprovoked nuclear assaults against North Korea. This, along with America's refusal of direct talks without the North's unconditional denuclearization, is justified with the reasoning that North Korean leaders are insane and irrational, and that the North Korean people are brainwashed. In other words, the US government's willingness to start a nuclear war is based on their own racist beliefs about North Koreans, a view that extends to all Koreans who resist that status quo, demonstrated consistently by the genocidal proportion of civilians killed by US forces during the Korean War, American complicity in the Gwangju massacre, and the deadly sanctions imposed during North Korea's ecological crisis and famine of the 1990s. The North's nuclear weapons program arose in response to this regime, understanding the status quo of US nuclear strike capability over Korea and broader East Asia as a concrete existential threat. Most, if not all, Korean Americans have experienced some form of racism in American society. And even if the American people themselves are less racist than before, the racism remains the most vicious and acceptable among the US elite, who are hungry to wage untenable wars against Russia and China and toy with the idea of the complete annihilation of the entire Korean people. We say all of this in a time when the American people are tired of war. We are more war-weary than we have ever been in our history. This political reality is intimately connected to our conviction in the Saturday Free School that the American people are in a process of becoming one people, a new nation capable of finally overcoming the triple evils of poverty, militarism, and racism as envisioned by Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. The ruling powers in this country are invested in sowing division among the people to prevent this achievement. Moreover, they seek to prevent the American people from truly knowing the world so that we fear the vast changes taking place in it. However, the American people are simultaneously disinvesting in our incompetent ruling class. Greater and greater portions of our people do not believe what the elites say anymore, seeking out alternative perspectives which resonate with their life worlds. We see the current moment as an opportunity like no other to open this country's perspectives on the total situation in Korea and its possible solutions. Why should anyone continue to trust the ruling class's messaging about the North when we have so much to gain by challenging old assumptions which prevent a path to positive peace on the peninsula? The long history of Korea shows that the Korean people are capable of resolving the problems and division imposed since the Korean War, armed with both old civilizational knowledge and the capacity to transform anew towards the future. We have faith that the American people, too, can come together in their entirety and chart a new path forward for the country. We thus bring this message firstly to Korean Americans. We seek to understand specifically how Korean Americans can contribute to advancing the American revolutionary process. The tasks of reconciling our history and fighting for peace are problems tailor-made for us to solve. The younger generation especially has a pivotal role to take up in this potentially pre-revolutionary period of transition. Through this process, Korean Americans can contribute something new to the transformation of the American people, just as Korea can contribute something new to the world by overcoming 70 years of imposed division to reunify and renew its civilization. As such, we also bring this message to the American people, who have been profoundly changed by Martin Luther King's vision of a new people who could say, "I'm not going to study war no more." King's message of peace, in opposition to the US occupation and bombing of Vietnam, also resonates with the struggle for peace on the Korean peninsula. Just as King once said that the bombs dropped in Vietnam explode in the ghettos, so too do the multi-billions of dollars dropped in Korea explode as bombs of neglect all across America. We appeal to the American people to come together, to talk with one another, and to seek their own way forward on the vital democratic question of war and peace. In the midst of a changing world order and threats to this peace, a united American people have the capacity to join the movement of humanity to achieve a new peace and a new world. The opportunity is ripe for us to make real the progressive and democratic promises set forth in past revolutionary periods of our history, which have already shaped so much of American life. Learning about Korea is important because its history, civilization, and people have something to give to the world movement towards a new era of world democracy. For Korean Americans, there is a movement happening amongst the broad mass of the American people that we must understand if we are to fully realize our identity as Americans. Korea has significance beyond our personal experiences and point of view. We have a chance to turn the painful experiences of our past into a strong chorus for peace and renewal. If the American people are to make good on their own potential, it will require gaining new insight from what countries like North Korea have been able to achieve, the human relations they have been able to develop, and the perspective they have to offer. We believe ultimately that Korean civilization is not a throwaway object to be trivialized or abandoned. Korea has a progressive message for all humanity. By joining under the banner of peace, Americans can become part of the great democratic experiment to discover this nation's true possibility as a synthesis of world civilizations. If we are to have a place in humanity's shared future, we must remake America into a civilization of peace. The voice of Martin Luther King comes back to remind us that we are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In the unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. The stakes of fighting for peace and reunification in Korea are high. This is a moral responsibility that we embrace, for it is one we cannot avoid. That's it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if people have thoughts, more comments. The last time we talked about this, it was really helpful, and I hope some of the changes that you can hear in this new version, like it speaks back to the discussion we had about the earlier version.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say that I love it so much, and it's so, I feel like hearing you read it was so emotional, not just because of the conversation we just had, but I feel like I really, especially the lines about Korea, like Korean civilization is not something to be discarded, because it made me think about something like how the way that people even view South Korea today. You're giving Koreans a path forward. And like it's not, because you're not just saying that North Korea good, South Korea bad, but you're giving a path forward which has a mess. And I love the way you said it has a message for America too. And I don't know, I don't even know what to say. I just think it's perfect and I love it so much. And I'm so excited for this event. And I can't wait to read it once it's published on the website.
Yeah, I also think it's a very impressive vision statement or appeal. And yeah, I mean, of course, given what's happening in the world, and I mean, if this general is talking about war with China in 2 years, I mean, you have to group that North Korea is part of that process, this military shift to East Asia, and I think that it was very interesting to hear, you know, about how you drew the parallels, the civil rights movement and the different democracy movement in South Korea and so on, and for peace in the Korean Peninsula. And I'm just very interested in the way this will be received, and also the timing, the fact that this will be coming like after this march that's happening. It seems, I mean, I think what's great about this march is that it's putting peace on the agenda for the American people in a bigger way. And so I think there'll be a lot of interest from people in, you know, this conference, and which one of the themes will be peace with North Korea, but also peace in the Korean Peninsula, and what that looks like as a question for humanity.
Yeah, I think it's really moving and very emotional, especially that part where you talk about this is the time when the American people are closer than they ever have been to becoming one people. And the emphasis you lay on the fact that people want to know about the world, and the American people in particular want to know about the world. They want to know about Korean civilization, and this knowledge is being kept from them in order to sort of keep them submissive to the status quo. I think, yeah, these are points that need to be made, and right now.
Yeah, thanks for the comments. Jones?
No. Well, it really has been very interesting and fun to write it, like to work on revising it, because I feel like like Doc, Jeremiah, Anna, me, like we all talk a lot, and then it actually really helps to like think of, okay, like what are the ideas, and then also all of the feedback we got like a few weeks ago about like emphasizing young people, like what synthesizing civilization actually means. I feel like trying to put that in made it a lot stronger, because we were definitely like, it's very hard to write about Korea and America, and then how it's relevant to like both, and then also the world. But I feel like it's better now thanks to like all of the discussions.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I'm really looking forward to the event, like programming, bringing people, and seeing how it'll build off of like the Du Bois event, the march, and like everything that we're talking about in Free School. Because yeah, it's crazy how coming out of the 10th anniversary, like it was a vision statement then, and then I feel like we actually did sort of chart a vision for the future that's also like aligning with a lot of events and developments that are taking place among the American people.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I know that there's a lot in the appeal, like many different components working together. And I think one of our aims with writing this and revising it was to make it like, I think a lot of the substance of it was kind of kept, but we wanted to formulate it so that it feels like a natural arc, and that even when you listen to it emotionally, that it feels like it's moving in a coherent way. And at the same time, I think, when people hear this out loud in an event, they may not fully like agree with or even grasp onto every single little thing that's said, but hopefully that one, they can feel the overall arc of it, but also that I think naturally people grab onto things that interest them already. And I think that we're trying to offer many different pieces as part of a larger framework that people can hold on to, and including free school people. Because I think something that's become clear we've been trying to work out the programming, like the panels and town hall and all of that, and who will present and like what will be presented on. I think it's becoming very clear to us that this is an event obviously about Korea, but I think this event will be a chance for the free school to work through ideologically many questions that we've already kind of taken initial stabs at, including the question of like a theoretical understanding of civilization, and especially like a modern civilization in this time, and like the whole context of like the changing world order, but also questions of the state of the whole people, questions like that. But also, I think it became really clear to us through talking that it's like, to a certain extent, I hope it was clear that we're bringing this message ultimately, like our primary audience is the American people. And obviously Korean Americans within that as a special audience, but the broad American people. And the question of war and democracy or like the question of war and peace is ultimately, you can think of it as almost like a democratic demand, like a democratic question. Like this is the question which fundamentally like is the kernel for like a new American democracy. And it has relevance not just for Korea, but for basically the remaking of the American people as a whole. And so, yeah, maybe that sounds a bit ambitious, but I think that we have a chance really to make an impact with this event and to really, I think, advance a lot of the questions that Free School has already been thinking about, especially going back to the 10th anniversary conference. But yeah, maybe if there's no further comments, we can go to Black Reconstruction.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the small thing I was going to say was just something we had said before, which was like hearing the appeal. And it always makes me reflect. I also thought about the 10th anniversary and then, yeah, this march, this anti-war rally, and then us and all of our conversations about Du Bois and a new revolutionary worldview that Free School is asserting. And I was like, sometimes I do feel like it all just coalesces and I'm like, God really does have a plan or something. Like that's how I feel sometimes.
Wait, can I say something really
Yeah.
quick too? I feel like because we spent the morning discussing the march, but Alice had read passages of Scott Ritter's, and I feel like it's not that I had this distinct sense listening to the appeal too that like it could in a sense be read at a kind of event like the march, which is a huge thing to say because they're very different. But I think that I think it does go back to the notion that what's uniting them, what's uniting what we're doing is the fact that, you know, we have had this hypothesis for a while, and that it's coming true before our eyes, and that what we're doing and is really important also that what the message that this event is bringing, that Korea has a place in this larger, I guess, picture towards building, you know, a new world order, but also how America fits into it. It all just felt like we were just speaking in a voice that American people already speak in and will easily understand, but more increasingly will start to be the way they look at the world and speak to one another and relate to one another. But not to distract us from the task at hand of Black Reconstruction.
Well, okay, I thought that we should just start from the very beginning of chapter 10, the Black Proletariat in South Carolina. Last week we focused on the footnote of why Du Bois changed the title from the dictatorship of the Black Proletariat in South Carolina to what it is now in the published book, which is the Black Proletariat in South Carolina. But before we start reading from the beginning, I just wanted to read one short paragraph from later in this chapter, which I think talked about, I feel like it's really related to even the discussion about how, if you're interested in the future of humanity or your own people in America, like how you understand the people's movement and how it's going to develop and the differing opinions that will help clarify the political task at hand. I just want to read like one short paragraph, if that's okay. It's on page 411. You're on mute, Doc, but I can read your lips, just so you know. But it's on my copy, page 411. It's this copy. Because it's short, I'm not going to screen share because it's too much work. But it starts at the bottom, starting with the rise of a group. And basically, this is Du Bois saying, what happens when you have a planter class, which has like this class, this ruling class, which is now defeated, broken, gone. And now you have a period of Reconstruction where there's the possibility and the rise of a dictatorship of the Black Proletariat in a state like South Carolina. He's talking about like a movement of people. How does that develop, and how does like a certain ideology, I don't know if that's the right word, but how does a political task and like differing opinions in a people's movement, how does that like take form? And I thought it'd be interesting to read in terms of like connecting to our conversation earlier. But he says, the rise of a group of a people is not a simultaneously shift of the whole mass. It is a continuous differentiation of individuals with inner strife and differences of opinion, so that individuals, groups, and classes begin to appear seeking higher levels, groping for better ways, uniting with other like-minded bodies and movements. Every indication of this was present among Negroes during Reconstruction times. There was not a single reform movement, a single step toward protest, a single experiment for betterment in which Negroes were not found in varying numbers. The protest against corruption and inefficiency in South Carolina had, in every case, Negro adherents and in many cases, Negro leaders. Yeah, and I feel I feel like it's maybe we can talk. I don't know if we want to talk about it now or later, but there's something Du Bois is also talking about in terms of the path, like the path, what happens in a revolutionary period, like the path forward, where people are basically trying to understand, like, okay, what's next? And I just like that Du Bois is saying it's not straightforward. The whole point is that as a people who are trying to understand the best society, like the best productive and social relations for society, it's not so straightforward. It's like you keep taking steps forward according to principle, and you're always going to have differing opinions, but people will always search for like-minded bodies with common values, common purposes, common principles, and it will, like, I don't know, almost evolve. And I don't know. Yeah, I just wanted to bring that up. But if no one else has a comment, we can start from the very beginning, because the first 3 pages of this chapter are super, like, are some of my favorites. I mean, I say that every week, but you know what I mean. Okay, let me share my screen and then, no, okay. So starting on my page 381, the Black Proletariat in South Carolina, which I do think, like Du Bois in some ways is saying, it could be called the dictatorship of the Black Proletariat in South Carolina. How in the years from 1868 to 1876, in a state where Blacks outnumbered whites, the will of the mass of Black labor, modified by their own and other leaders and dimmed by ignorance, inexperience, and uncertainty, dictated the form and methods of government. Also, as I read, because I can't see your faces, if you want to say something, just come off mute and I'll stop reading. Okay. A great political scientist in one of the oldest and largest of American universities wrote and taught thousands of youths and readers that, quote, "There is no question now that Congress did a monstrous thing and committed a great political error, if not a sin, in the creation of this new electorate. It was a great wrong to civilization to put the white race of the South under the domination of the Negro race. The claim that there is nothing in the color of the skin from the point of view of political ethics is a great sophism. A black skin means membership in a race of men which has never of itself succeeded in subjecting passion to reason, has never therefore created any civilization of any kind." End quote. Here is the crux of all national discussion and study of Reconstruction. The problem is incontinently put beyond investigation and historic proof by the dictum of Judge Taney, Andrew Johnson, John Burgess, and their confreres, that Negroes are not men and cannot be regarded and treated as such. The student who would test this dictum by facts is faced by this set barrier. The whole history of Reconstruction has, with few exceptions, been written by passionate believers in the inferiority of the Negro. The whole body of facts concerning what the Negro actually said and did, how he worked, what he wanted, for whom he voted, is masked in such a cloud of charges, exaggeration, and biased testimony that most students have given up all attempt at new material or new evaluation of the old, and simply repeated perfunctorily all the current legends of Black buffoons in legislature. Golden spittoons for field hands, bribery and extravagance on an unheard of scale, and the collapse of civilization until an outraged nation rose in wrath and ended the ridiculous travesty. And yet there are certain quite well-known facts that are irreconcilable with this theory of history. Civilization did not collapse in the South in 1868 to 1876. The charge of industrial anarchy is faced by the fact that the cotton crop had recovered by 1870, 5 years after the war. And by 1876, the agricultural and even commercial and industrial rebirth of the South was in sight. The public debt was large, but measured in depreciated currency and estimated with regard to war losses. In the enlarged functions of a new society, it was not excessive. The legislation of this period was not bad, as is proven by the fact that it was retained for long periods after 1876, and much of it still stands. One must admit that generalizations of this sort are liable to wide error, but surely they can justifiably be balanced against the extreme charges of a history written for purposes of propaganda. And above all, no history is accurate, and no quote-unquote political science, scientific, that starts with the gratuitous assumption that the Negro race has been proven incapable of modern civilization. Such a dogma is simply the modern and American residue of a universal belief that most men are subnormal, and that civilization is the gift of the chosen few. Since the beginning of time, most thinkers have believed that the vast majority of human beings are incorrigibly stupid and evil. The proportion of thinkers who believe this has naturally changed with historical evolution. In earliest times, all men but the chosen few were impossible. Before the middle class of France revolted, only the aristocracy of birth and knowledge could know and do. After the American experiment, a considerable number of thinkers conceived that possibly most men had capabilities, except, of course, Negroes. Possibly never in human history before or since have so many men believed in the manhood of so many men as after the Battle of Port Hudson, when Negroes fought for freedom. Yeah, I guess I wanted to stop there and just say that the reason why, beginning on this specific page, this is where I think Du Bois is building upon the last chapter we read from, which is The Price of Disaster, where in the last chapter, if you remember, in The Price of Disaster, it was what Serafina referenced earlier with the two worlds, the two solar systems for one pulse of a second in 1,000 years coincided, and revolution, Reconstruction was possible, a dictatorship of the Black Proletariat was possible. And I feel like here, what Du Bois is doing in this chapter with this page is he's not just talking about economic revolution, but Du Bois is starting to also get into the philosophy of history. And he's also, I think, talking about capacity. It's the question of do you believe not just Black people, but do you believe that ordinary people who are working class and poor, are they capable of civilization? Are they motivated by goodness? And that's what I really love. We'll read more of it, but that's what I think Du Bois is starting to talk about. He's starting to get, this is not just a book about economic revolution, but he's starting to talk about what is your approach to knowledge and history? Do you believe that most people are good? Do you believe that ordinary people are constantly striving for something greater, for civilization? Is an average human being, are the poor capable of building great civilization? Oh yeah, because I can't see the screen, I don't know if anyone else wanted to say anything before we keep reading.
No.
Okay, so we'll keep going. All men know that by sheer weight of physical force, the mass of men must, in the last resort, become the arbiters of human action. But reason, skill, wealth, machines, and power may for long periods enable the few to control the many. But to what end? The current theory of democracy is that dictatorship is a stopgap, pending the work of universal education, equitable income, and strong character. But always the temptation is to use the stopgap for narrower ends, because intelligence, thrift, and goodness seem so impossibly distant for most men. We rule by junta. We turn fascist because we do not believe in men. Yet the basis of fact in this disbelief is incredibly narrow. We know perfectly well that most human beings have never had a decent human chance to be full men. Most of us may be convinced that even with opportunity, the number of utter human failures would be vast. And yet, remember that this assumption kept the ancestors of present white America long in slavery and degradation. Yeah, I love that part. It is then one's moral duty to see that every human being, to the extent of his capacity, escapes ignorance, poverty, and crime. With this high ideal held unswervingly in view, monarchy, oligarchy, dictatorships may rule, but the end will be the rule of all. If mayhap all or most qualify. The only unforgivable sin is dictatorship for the benefit of fools, voluptuaries, gilded satraps, prostitutes, and idiots. The rule of the famished, unlettered, stinking mob is better than this, and the only inevitable, logical, and justifiable return. To escape from ultimate democracy is as impossible as it is for ignorant poverty and crime to rule forever. Yes, do you want to say something about that?
I don't have a thing. I can't speak that good.
May I say something, Emily? Yeah. This is one of the most eloquent cases. First of all, he's making the argument for the dictatorship of the proletariat as a democratic project in the movement towards a social order predicated upon the values of communism. That's what he's saying. Now, here Du Bois is arguing differently, perhaps, from what Marx and people anchored to political economy would argue. What he is saying is that democracy is the ultimate objective of all human striving. And by democracy, he means the rule of all by all. Some would say it's utopian, but he takes what is theorized by many as utopian, a wish, and says that it is possible if we believe in the humanity of all human beings. You see the way he's arguing? So he's starting from Reconstruction, and he's saying that for, quote, men to be men in the fullest sense, there must be a democracy, a new democracy, the rule of all by all, where people rule themselves. Now, we're talking about libertarianism. A socialist libertarian like Noam Chomsky would speak of these same issues in purely economic terms. Another guy, an economist named Richard Wolff, you could see him on YouTube a lot. He is an anarchist socialist, what we call a syndical anarchist. In other words, that by workers taking control of their workplaces, this in effect is socialism in practice. However, again, Du Bois is a sociologist, and he is looking at man as potential. And so you could see a different, how would you call it? It's almost as though he's painting a picture. It is a tapestry. The human beings as a part, if they are freed, as a part of a great symphonic a great symphony, a great work of art. It's so interesting how his sociology is so often imagined in artistic terms, in artistic ways. That's all I wanted to say.
What?
Oh yeah, because what you're saying, Doc, I remember I had read like a long time ago, Du Bois was like, I forget where he said, but he said democracy is opportunity. And I kind of didn't know what he meant by that, but I feel like he's saying it here where he says like we know perfectly well that most human beings have never had a decent human chance to be full men. And I also I guess I wanted to add that I feel like Du Bois, when he says this thing about that, remember that it's this assumption that kept the ancestors of present white America long in slavery and degradation. He's also making a point about he's making a point about almost race. Like in some ways it's the Baldwin thing. Like he's making a point about like the prison that white Americans are in by, you know what I mean? And because I also feel like in some ways Du Bois is sets the stage, like even just the basic stage of explaining why like Black and white must unite for freedom. And to free the South is to free the country, but to free Black humanity is to free your own humanity, Yeah.
Just one other thing. I do agree with you completely. A lot of readers of this text, just at the level of feeling, they don't feel it. They really don't feel it, but they don't feel it because they don't understand what he's doing. Most people who say, we want Du Bois to be a Marxist, this is a Marxist work, they become disappointed because he doesn't talk like a Marxist, or he doesn't write like a Marxist. And part of the problem is he does a unique way of sociology. And it's always, what are humans capable of? What he said, what are working people who have been oppressed for thousands and thousands of years, what are they capable of? And it is, again, a sociological framing of the question. He is clearly, in some ways you could say Rousseau, Voltaire, those tribunes of the French Revolution would speak in these utopian terms also, but they spoke almost purely philosophically. Du Bois is speaking sociologically. He is really speaking sociologically. And his sociology, by the way, is not the sociology of human misery. It is the sociology of human potential. Whole nother ball game, whole nother approach. And he's clearly talking, when he talks about the rule of all by all, man, and when he uses the word man, I don't think anybody should think he's being a misogynist. It is that man was the generic of humanity. We would not use it that way necessarily today, or maybe we would. But the point is, man qua man, man as man, can only be realized in a radical democracy that is, in a lot of ways, communistic. And so this idea, one small thing, this idea, I've been talking about this with Nuri and Jerry and Anna so often. For instance, you take a place like North Korea. Are the social relations more akin to communist social relationships? While the economy has not yet reached such a level. And is it possible for human societal relationships to leap ahead of economic relationships rather than the other way around? That you first have to radically change the political economy in order to change the social relation, societal relations. That's what I want to say. Societal relations. Is it possible? And I think you could make this argument from Lenin and Du Bois. Is it possible to so radically change the relationships of human beings that in so doing you lay the foundations for a revolutionary change in economic relations? That's all I have to say.
Can I ask a question? So you were saying, I think I'm following, but you're saying about how Du Bois, with the focus on democracy and manhood, by which means humanity, is kind of differing from the classical Marxist formulation. So would it be accurate to say that Du Bois is talking about, like the engine of history is a struggle for democracy in this sense of like human uplift of majority of humanity, versus the classical Marxist in contrast would say that it's this kind of idea of just class struggle and class against class. I'm just asking about how do we see can you say more about that distinction, especially when it comes to then this period of Reconstruction?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I just want to make the point that Du Bois is not grounded in his argument in political economy. He's grounded in two concepts, I would say. Two practices. One, sociology as he understands it and as he practices it. And that is the study of human capacity. The other thing is that he argues or he assumes that the struggle for democracy is also the struggle to advance civilization. And I guess a third point I would make is that he's a radical Democrat, a revolutionary Democrat. That's why, he doesn't, for him, it's not a shocking thing to talk about a dictatorship of the proletariat, as the repairing and rebuilding of the conditions for democracy, for fuller democracy. Okay. What was the point I'm trying to make? I guess I don't know whether that's what I can remember I wanted to say at this point. I don't know that I answered the question well, but he's talking about democracy. He's a democratic theorist. He's not in the John Locke Anglo-Saxon tradition of individual rights. Democracy is a collective project. It is a collective project of the working people, of the oppressed, of the enslaved. That it is they and not an elite that will forge this communistic democracy. And he's obviously absorbed and synthesized both the John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, the Anglo-Saxon tradition, but I think he is more leaning to the French tradition of Rousseau and Voltaire and others and the French Revolution. He is not an anarchist. He believes in society as a whole. And he believes that the working people, the poor, are capable of leaps through the centuries. If I could just say one last point, so much of Trump is a fascist, settler colonialist theories is based upon the assumption of the backwardness of working people. And I would say for Du Bois, that is a labeling of the poor. They are backward until they aren't. They are backward until they make a revolution. And then they leap through the centuries. They're backward because of the conditionalities of capitalism. So it is a relative backwardness, and it is a backwardness, quote unquote, claimed on their behalf by the elites who claim to be enlightened. Because if the working class and the poor are backward, as is claimed about the American people, then the opposite side of that is that there is an enlightened elite. And if they tell you to take COVID vaccine, take it. If they tell you to go to war, go to war. If they tell you anything, follow them, because they know. And Du Bois is challenging that.
Can I ask a follow-up question to Jahan's question? So I'm trying to make sense of how Du Bois and Lenin would talk with each other. And I think, like, if I understand like Lenin's whole like state and revolution argument, basically he's saying that socialism, the dictatorship of the proletariat, is democracy. So this is Lenin, but Lenin would say that eventually democracy, which presupposes a state, needs to be overcome by communism, and that a communist society would not have a state, and therefore you would overcome democracy. But when Du Bois talks about ultimate democracy, is he talking about a communist society that would still have need for a state and therefore a need for democracy? I guess part of what I'm asking is it a difference of actual, like, is it actually a theoretical like difference, or is it a difference of semantics?
See, we're dealing, I think in this discussion, be it Lenin or Du Bois, we're dealing in the realm of what Du Bois at the beginning of the chapter talked about as political science. A science that studies political institutions and political behavior like that. And then we're dealing in the area of testable hypotheses or competing and testable hypotheses. Does the state wither away? Well, that's a hypothesis based upon one's understanding of historical logic, but there is no evidence in history of a state withering away. That's one thing. However, there are instances, as in the case of the South, of the state collapsing, or in the case of China with the collapse of the Qing dynasty, and in Russia with the collapse of the Tsar's regime. The state collapses. Okay, what comes in its place? Du Bois and Lenin, I think Lenin, but certainly Du Bois here, is a dictatorship of the Black Proletariat. You know what I'm saying? The only way to prepare the conditions for the forward march of the working people, in this instance, the formerly enslaved proletariat. Does that make sense? So, but see, the rule of all by all. In other words, the assumption that you don't need the state in its classic iteration. Let's put it this way: the state as it developed under capitalism. And we know we live with that, so we have an idea what that is. If that's no longer here, then what replaces it, and what replaces what replaced it? In other words, what replaces the collapsed state? Okay, and what replaces what replaced the collapsed state? Now, the closest to that, replacing what replaced the collapsed state, is the state of the whole people, which is not a state in the old sense that Lenin uses it, as the dictatorship of a ruling class. Suppose you don't have a ruling class. Suppose all people are now equal and do not need a ruling class to protect narrow interest. Okay? I think, if I'm thinking straight, because I'm getting a little confused myself, but what Du Bois is saying, he's making an argument that working people are indeed capable of creating the state that replaces the collapsed regime. And as they are educated and so on and developed in society, they will replace what replaced the collapsed state with something, and this is what I'm kind of extending, with something that looks a lot like communist social relationships or societal relationships. That's what I think he's arguing. It is a theoretical argument. It is Du Bois's theoretical argument is anchored to his sociology. Okay. In terms of a testable hypothesis, I think he is closer to verifying his hypothesis because he's close to the South. And in time frame, he's so close to this collapsed state, the planter regime. So and then he studied the South. These are not people he did not study. He lived in the South most of his career. You see what I'm saying? And then he brings to the whole issue all of his study, and this is what becomes, the guy is a complete intellectual. He knows a lot, but he doesn't beat the drum. Oh, I'm quoting this. Oh, I know all of this. It's just imminent, I should say imminent, in the whole work, the whole discussion. You see what I'm saying? The whole discussion shows a profound knowledge of discussions of democracy from the period of the English Revolution and the French and American revolutions. And then he goes beyond it. Okay? It's so ironic and interesting, if I might say. He goes beyond it, but he goes beyond it not by talking about democracy and individual rights, but by talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat. A class, an openly class project, which must dissolve itself to becoming a state that is not a state in the ways that it had normally been talked about. I don't know whether that makes sense. It kind of makes sense to me in my drunken state, but I don't know.
Yeah, because Is it okay if I read some of Danny's comments too regarding this? Because Danny was saying that we have to clarify what is meant.
Can I just say one thing? I would argue that Du Bois is not making Lenin's argument, which is not to say that he is against Lenin, but he's not making Lenin's argument. He's not arguing the way Lenin would argue.
Right. Okay. Yeah, Danny is saying we have to clarify what is meant by, quote, the rule of all by all, because that also means that no one actually rules, and yet there is an authority of all. That is a libertarian idea, a la Rousseau.
Can I just say what? Danny is absolutely right. It's ironic, the rule of all by all, which means that there is not rule in the ways traditionally thought of.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the whole, yeah.
Yeah. I think Noel Ignatiev's analogy was good here in that Du Bois's argument is akin to Lenin's two tactics, that the Black Proletariat has to carry the bourgeois democratic revolution because the capitalists/planters are blocking it in the US with race codes, protectionism, literacy tests, etc. The problem of democracy is more complicated in Reconstruction than in the 18th century. And then I think maybe he's engaging in conversation with you, but he says, we don't reduce truth to empirical facts. Democracy would wither away because it renders itself superfluous. Do we believe that people have the capacity to regulate themselves, to be peaceful? That was the ideal of, quote, civil society, which cannot regulate itself at the moment because one cannot be civil. And he's saying, I think, regarding the state of the whole people idea, if the state of the whole people is something different, then why call it a state then at all? I take it that he's making the argument that the ends of Reconstruction went beyond what is empirically what happened, that we can read history against the grain, that the collapse of Reconstruction was not inevitable. And I think partially, maybe, okay, this is just a preliminary thought, but I think part of what Du Bois is saying is that you have the dictatorship of the Black Proletariat, but that this has to lead to basically like a broadening of the state too. And that I don't actually know if Du Bois is foreclosing the idea of a stateless society per se, but that like there has to actually be like a longer period in which you need a state and authority to instill new social relations, like new capabilities of the people to regulate themselves. And that maybe it would be a longer and more drawn out process than Lenin initially foresaw. I don't know, that may be a misreading of Lenin, but that kind of feels like what Du Bois is saying.
No, can I just say, yes. See, I think State and Revolution is an outline. It is not an empirical study. And I agree with whoever said empirical evidence does not close the argument. You have to have what I call the pre-experimental, the pre-empirical. You know, there has to be historically and sociologically grounded assumptions. So you can't settle the argument just with data. Never, 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 never. I can't say never enough. That's part of the bullshit that a lot of people get reduced to. But Du Bois is not laying out a framework of discussion, a framework for political practice, as Lenin was doing in the State and Revolution. What Du Bois, and then of course Lenin is defending Engels and Marx on the question of the state. Du Bois is not quite doing that. Du Bois is actually studying and even treating these very questions that he's raising in this chapter as hypotheses to be tested. Again, in Du Bois, you get the probable. It is probable that this could happen, But then there's there's probability and possibility. It is possible this could happen, but what were its probabilities, and what are the conditions that would turn a probability into a possibility? That's what he's looking at. Now he's, 75 years out from the end of the Civil War, and he's saying, when we read it, he's saying, look, this is still the central experience in American history, which must be studied to understand American history and democracy. And all arguments, be they from politicians or academics and researchers, have to be the criteria of the truth value of their arguments has to be how we understand Reconstruction, the greatest American democratic movement, greater than the American Revolution itself. I don't know whether I'm making myself, and I feel that I'm not making myself clear. I feel I'm talking all over the place, and I don't mean to be. Forgive me. But Du Bois is not Lenin. Du Bois is dealing with realities and conditions and possibilities for research that Lenin could not. Du Bois is looking at a concrete historical moment. Lenin is, in State and Revolution, creating a guidebook, an introduction based upon Marx and Engels' writing about the state. Because there were a lot of people, in his party in Europe that were unclear. Their own, and that if literally what Lenin was saying, if the working class takes power, it can rule. It doesn't have to turn power back to the liberals and the elites. That like a lot of people in the United States, they call themselves democratic socialists. And they want you to know we believe in individual liberty, which I think is the most bad faith kind of argument. I'm a socialist, but I believe in the capitalist assumptions about governance. What Du Bois says, I'm a socialist and I don't accept as historically necessary or inevitable the rule by a small elite of capitalists. But he and Lenin are on the same page there. But he's not making a Leninist argument. He's making he's not only making an argument, he is doing the social historical research. It's almost from the ground up.
Yeah, wait, okay. It reminds me of the next few sentences. Wait, no, I really loved everything you said, Doc. Like, you really clarified specifically Du Bois's science. Like, Du Bois's science is like Lenin, what you said, what Lenin is doing is he's trying to create a guide. Like, it's a if. Like, he's like, if, like, it's a guide, and like he's also defending Marx and Engels, but Du Bois's science is from the ground up. Like, he's studying a concrete historical moment and saying this is a human experiment.
Absolutely. And hence the concrete universal in opposition to the abstract universal.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and
right.
then it has world. It doesn't just have implications for America. It has
Oh yeah.
worldwide concrete implications and and almost like theoretical implications on what we understand to be democracy, like the theory of democracy, like human action. I feel like I'm not using the right words, but okay, wait, but yeah, because Du Bois says, quote, this move on 383, the opportunity to study a great human experiment was present in Reconstruction.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And its careful scientific investigation would have thrown a world of light upon a world of light on human development and democratic government.
See, if I could just say, Du Bois is always, you see this in many of his works, an opportunity to study.
Right.
And he always says that we can study this. Why is he so interested in study? He's interested in the truth. He's interested in
Right.
scientific discovery.
Mhm.
He's not saying this is the theory of the state. He's saying it gives us an opportunity to study the state and democracy. That's what is so well, I'm with you, Emily. It's so appealing and so attractive and so humble.
Yeah.
You know, it gives us the opportunity to study. And it's not, you know, it's just so wonderful. And that should be the posture of the scientist anyway. Be he social or she's social scientist or natural, the opportunity to study.
And then he says, the material today, however, is unfortunately difficult to find. Little effort has been made to preserve the records of Negro effort in speeches, actions, work, and wages, homes, and families. Nearly all this has gone down beneath a mass of ridicule and caricature, deliberate omission and misstatement. No institution of learning has made any effort to explore or probe Reconstruction from the point of view of the laborer. And most men have written to explain and excuse the former slaveholder, the planter, the landholder, and the capitalist. The loss today is irreparable, and this present study limps and gropes in darkness, lacking most essentials to a complete picture. And yet, the writer is convinced that this is the story of a normal working class movement, successful to an unusual degree, despite all disappointment and failure. Whew.
You see, here, you know, Du Bois, when he writes, I don't care whether souls of Black folk, wherever, you know, there's always that element of autobiography of the son. And this is very interesting. You know, a lot of scientists try to separate their experiments and research from themselves. Oh, I'm just objective. You know, in other words, a computer using AI could have done the same thing. You know, in fact, they would say it could do it better. Du Bois says that scientists, and especially social scientists, come to the study of society and history with assumptions, with learning, with education, with ideas. That, and Du Bois says this all the time, that I go into this with certain assumptions, certain beliefs, but if the facts and the experience on the ground goes in another direction, well, I have to reconsider my assumptions and then redo the research. You see what I'm saying? That spirit of scientific research. And this is him. You know, and then he talks about this part here, the agony of not being able to get evidence on the life world of Black folk because what they did wasn't considered serious, and then it was burned, torn up, discarded, and it's not there. So then he has to go back to a lot of his own experiences in the South. You know, when he went to Fisk, when he was teaching at Atlanta University, he was always doing research on Black people in the South, how they acted, the churches, the religion, their, you know, whatever they did, their family structures, all of that, to piece together their social relationships. And he always knew that it was not just the internal life of Black people that decided Black people, but it was also the exterior life, the external world of the color line, but of other things happening in the world. So he has to, I mean, it's just such a beautiful way of doing research because they're what you call multi-level analysis. It is the world, but it is the county in South Carolina. It is the politician, but it is also the illiterate peasant. They are all a part of putting together and framing what life was and what the possibilities were. That's why, and my last point, I know I'm talking too much. See, there's several things. The imagination, the imaginative, the imaginary, usually associated with the artist, the musician, the composer. You understand what I'm saying? The imaginary. If an artist is nothing, she or he, unlike most of us, has a great imagination. And usually that you could see in these artists and composers and stuff in their childhood. You know, they call them dreamers. But that imaginative part is a part of science. You know what I'm saying? Of an imagination, of creative, non-empirically grounded thinking. But then, you know, the social scientists just can't be a dreamer. At some point, you have to do the low down dirty work of getting data, of looking at different, one set of data might say X, another say Y, you know, all of those things. And we see it in this work. And that's why, see, I would argue, and this is not an anti-Marxist argument, that in methodological and social scientific terms, Du Bois is not the same as Marx. Not at all. I think Marx was more dependent upon a theory to explain future facts. Du Bois was more grounded in like sociologists do, in facts, in data, not facts, but data, evidence. So it's very different. You read Das Kapital, you read Black Reconstruction, hey, day and night almost, day and night.
Well, I actually thought that might be well. So those are the main passages I wanted to discuss for today because it's 2:10. Oh, I'm okay. See, I usually can read your lips, but I'm having a hard time.
And we're all tired and hungry.
Oh, okay.
Woo.
But
I'm not tired, I'm hungry. I'm
that
just
was a
thinking.
great, yeah. I feel like there's a lot I'm thinking about. Yeah, especially what you said about Du Bois is always autobiographical in his science.
And no, let me put it this way. In his presentation of his findings, he's always said, I had to struggle with this. This was not easy. So much of what I needed to put this together had been destroyed. You know, I wasn't allowed into certain archives because I was Black. And so he's, you know, it's like he's working. You can see his working, his work ethic and his method of work. That's what I find as a sociologist, I find so fascinating.
It couldn't be more different than this is a short comment, but it couldn't be more different than the way we've been discussing how like Gerald Horne puts together a research project and like if he's so dependent on archives, think about how Du Bois could not even access archives and yet was able to put together just something with just a better and deeper philosophy and epistemology. I know this is just going back to our last discussion, and I don't have enough of the formulation to quite connect all of it. But yeah, it just makes you appreciate Du Bois so much more.
No, and you know, just like future political economy after Marx never quite reached his level, historical writing after Du Bois never reaches this level.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying? It is a unique mind carrying out the most intense and serious scientific study of actual history, an actual historical moment. It is, you don't find this. You don't find, this is why it is so important to understand what he's doing. Don't think you're going to speed read this book. You're not going to do it.
You can't.
You know? And it's not because there's so much data or long quotes from different people. It is because of, oh God, I can't. It's because of his, let me just put it this way, the magnitude of the project.
Yeah.
Because he's not just talking about Reconstruction, he's talking about American history, but he's also, I think, I said world history.
Yeah, you know, well, I've at least attended graduate level courses where the entire book was discussed in 1 hour or less than 1 hour.
You mean Black Reconstruction?
Yeah.
Oh no! Oh, I can't believe
it was a signed reading, but it was assigned along with I think 2 other books for a 3-hour seminar. So we spent about 1 hour on it. You can imagine how we barely scratched the surface. I mean, you know, you've talked about it before that it's basically just okay, challenge the Dunning School, racist stereotypes. Okay, thank you very much. Just move on.
Right.
But I mean, I'm leaving with a lot of things on my mind, but particularly one thing I'm really now you know, processing, understanding is I think that what distinguishes the Du Boisian revolutionary science or revolutionary social science from merely academic social science or history writing is, I think, one of the major things is precisely this focus on, like you said, what can turn probability into possibility, which I think is deeply linked to this belief in the capacity of people and this approach to, because if you're interested in revolutionary science, you're interested in studying something to understand the capacity of people to struggle, to fight for their freedom, whether historically or currently. And I just, you know, because also whenever you talk about, you know, for example, in the university, if you propose that you want to study some great movement, whether it's Reconstruction, civil rights movement, peace movement, one of the big questions is always like, well, how do you explain the failure of that movement? Because clearly we haven't solved civil rights, haven't solved American democracy, haven't solved World War. But I think this is really the answer, is that you're studying the capacity, you're studying what is the possibility of all these movements of the past, and you have to view it from that perspective, rather than trying to look at them in this way of failure. I mean, again, we've talked about before the idea of failure versus incompleteness.
Yes, yes,
You know,
yes.
you have to fully understand what they were striving for, what is the capacity, possibility, and it's helping me understand more this discussion about dictatorship of the Black Proletariat, because again, that's attacked by people of like, what was that? It makes no sense, blah blah blah. So yeah,
I think so much of Du Bois makes all the sense in the world if you read it,
mm-hmm.
if you're capable of reading it.
Mm-hmm. If you study it, not just
yeah,
read it, but
studied it. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And if there's so much. Du Bois is so trivialized almost to embarrassment. By very mediocre people.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a mediocre person trivializing a great thinker.
Right. I mean, this is also why you can't just group it into the, I don't know, Black Atlantic, Black, this is Black Reconstruction and Black Jacobins, Black Reconstruction and Wretched of the Earth, Black Reconstruction and some other book by a Black person,
or Cedric Robinson.
Right.
To lump it together with C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins and Richard Wright's Native Son as a way of contextualizing the Black radical tradition. No, you can't do that. This is a singular work. Probably the most consequential work written in this country, not probably is, and its consequences, its significances go beyond this country, way beyond this country. And we will discover this as we go forward.
Okay, so we're gonna end here for.
Can I just say one thing before we go? Emily, we're planning several carpools going down to Washington. Do we have any beginning concrete planning thus far? Who's driving?
Not yet, but I'm highly confident that there's enough interest for there to be probably 3 cars.
Oh, at least.
Yeah,
I think I'm sorry to interrupt, but on the website of the march, they had a thing about transportation and hotel blocking or something. If that is helpful, I don't know. But I guess you probably have enough people to drive.
Yeah,
we're just gonna do a day trip, but we'll start making plans. Okay, so thanks everybody for participating and watching. I'm gonna end the live stream now.